All right. Good afternoon. I call to order the May 2022 meeting of the Finance and Operations Committee of the University of Minnesota Board of Regents. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to those who are joining us via the live stream video and those attending in our boardroom or via Zoom. Let me welcome our student representatives for today, Emily Kurtz from the Twin Cities campus and Cal Mergendahl from the Morris campus. Thanks everyone for being here today. The first item on our agenda is an item for action on the proposed amendments to the Board of Regents policy, property and facility use. No changes have been made to the amendments since we reviewed them at our February meeting. Assistant Vice President Leslie Krieger is here to answer any final questions you may have. But before we turn to discussion, is there a motion to recommend adoption of the proposed amendments to the Board of Regents policy, property and facility use?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Regent Rocha?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I like the language. It looks like it's a nice, clear policy. One question, and we may have covered this to some extent. How does this impact? I mean, I know historically we've had a lot of donated property. In fact, in another era, at one time, if you looked at the map, just dotted all across the state, we would have parcels, especially northern Minnesota, where families had bequeathed the property to the university. Does this affect our willingness, our ability, our likelihood of continuing to receive those kinds of donations? Sometimes they had expectations of being used for research, and sometimes it was simply just a matter of here's a resource, do with it what you will. Does this clarity that this is a little more, I wouldn't want to say Spartan, but this is a little bit more direct, that we're not holding property just to hold it, that it needs to form a function. Does that affect our relationship with donors?
Chair Mayron, Regent Rocha, that's a great question. And so we still have a process, and as you noted, that in some cases, the property is donated for a mission-related function. And in that case, the Regents of the University of Minnesota and the real estate office manages that transition. And we would go through the same due diligence process in terms of environmental phase 1 and potentially a phase 2 analysis, surveys, all of that regular due diligence that we would do to determine whether the property meets those needs. And we would be guided by these principles. And so from a standpoint of supporting the mission of the university, the campus plans or a research and outreach plan, balancing those scarce resources, as well as then that, positively impacting the adjacent areas. In many cases, and most recently, I think more cases have been where the land has been donated, it has been to be monetized. And in that case, it goes through the foundation. And so the real estate office doesn't go through that process, and that goes straight to the foundation.
Any follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And just to be clear, so when someone wants to do that, does the university, taking them as separate entities, does the university know about it? So there's at least that prospect of identifying whether there's a use, or would it just simply go directly to the foundation without passing go, so to speak?
Chair Mayron, Regent Rocha, yes, we do. We are in contact with our foundation representatives, and we have that conversation as to whether or not they wish it to be monetized or whether or not there is a mission-related use. So we have this past year, we have a gift agreement, and we did go through the analysis of, is there a mission-related use? And in that case, the University of Minnesota Morris determined that there was a future mission related to a particular property. And this is just a gift agreement. So at the time that the owner of the property passes, that would be a time when we would go through that due diligence, and we would then bring it to the Board of Regents for your approval.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Regent Sviggum.
Madam Chair, thank you. Let me add to Regent Rocha's support for the words under the principles. The guiding principles, I think, Leslie, are extremely important as we look. My perception is the university is a lot better at acquiring land than we are disposing of. And if we have properties that don't fit within our plan for the university, or we don't have plans for use of the properties now or through even into the long-term future. I just got this feeling it should be back in the private sector, paying taxes and making money. And so I like the words specifically as it adds this disposition of the properties.
All right. I don't think that requires any further comment by you, Vice President Krieger. Any further questions or discussion? There being no further discussion, we appear ready to vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up for review is the President's recommended fiscal year 2023 annual capital improvement budget. Senior Vice President Franz and Vice President Bertelsen will take us through the capital budget. Senior Vice President Franz, please proceed.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, Vice Chair McMillan, and members of the committee. The second agenda item before you today is the fiscal year 2023 annual capital improvement budget. And the third agenda item is the fiscal year 2023 annual operating budget. So as we come before this committee today for a review of the capital budget and the operating budget for fiscal year 23, I'd like to take a moment to review the timing context for both of these budgets. First, for the capital budget, this past fall, we brought to you for review and action, the 2021 six-year capital plan and the 2022 state capital request. Trying to keep all these numbers for the year straight. The six-year capital plan sets the priorities and direction for our ongoing academic and capital planning efforts for, well, 6 years. The state capital request presents the university's request to the governor and the legislature for state-supported capital projects during the 2022 legislative session, which is currently underway. In December, the university submitted a supplemental capital request for $685.6 million to the governor, and the governor included in his bill $213.8 million, consisting of $141.8 million of capital asset renewal, or HEAPR, as we call it, and $72 million for the Twin Cities Chemistry Teaching Project. Legislative committees are now considering what the 2022 legislative bonding package will be that they recommend to the governor. We hope that the bonding bill will support the university's capital request and will be passed. The day for legislative adjournment is May 23. I've learned in my experience to hope, but not predict. So with that background, we will see what happens. But today we're going to present to you our recommended 2023 annual capital improvement budget for what we anticipate, and what focuses on this next fiscal year. The recommended budget includes the university's request to the legislature, plus other projects that Vice Bertelsen will review for you in a moment. We'll return to this committee in June for approval of this recommended capital budget. We will amend this recommended capital budget based on the final outcome of the legislative session. Second, today we present the university's 2023 annual operating budget. Now, the state of Minnesota operates on a biennial budget cycle, the two-year time frame structure under which the state appropriates funding to the university. Fiscal 23 is the second year in the current biennium. The university prepares and implements two annual budgets within each biennium. Therefore, this fiscal 23 budget that we're proposing is a second year appropriation, and that amount is known and it is incorporated into this budget consistent with state law. For all other revenues and total expenditures, this budget contains updated estimates and the recommendations for fiscal year 23. As with the capital request, we are monitoring the university's state supplemental budget request as it makes its way through legislative committees at the state capitol. Again, we hope that our operating budget request will be supported by the legislature. We'll update this committee at the June meeting, also as more information is available. Now back to the agenda item number 2 that Vice President Bertelsen is going to talk about. This is the annual capital budget for this next year, and it's going to include items in our state capital request, university-funded projects, including those in our auxiliaries and athletics, as well as projects funded by repair and replacement pools. Madam Chair, with your permission, I will turn it over to Vice President Mike Bertelsen with the details of the recommended capital budget.
Thank you. Vice President Bertelsen.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. So first off, per board policy, the administration prepares both a 6-year plan and an annual capital budget. The 6-year capital improvement plan serves as the foundation for major capital investments. We bring an updated plan for you every fall for your review and action of that 6-year plan. In May and June, the board reviews and takes action on the university's annual capital improvement budget for the next fiscal year. This presentation covers the projects that we'll be undertaking in the coming fiscal year. This slide gives you the breakdown of the 2 major categories that projects included in the capital budget. Those in the state request and those funded by the university, with a variety of funding sources outside of the bonding bill. As you can see, we rely on the state for a substantial portion of our capital funding, about 2/3 in FY23. Later slides will detail the individual projects that make up the state request and university funded project totals. The annual capital budget represents year 1 of the 6-year plan. This includes individual projects that are larger than $1 million, as well as approval for projects of pools of funding for repair and replacement and HEAPR that fund many facility renewal projects. The annual capital budget authorizes major projects to move into design and construction this coming fiscal year. Anything appearing on the list must have completed pre-design and be fully funded in order to be included in this plan. One major point of information regarding the budget document before you, as Senior Vice President Franz has said, the university's practice at this meeting has been to include the full value of the university's state request in the annual capital budget if the final outcome of the binding bill is not yet known, like this year. When we come back in June, we will amend this budget based upon the final outcome of the legislative session. For your reference, these are the projects included in the University of Minnesota's calendar year 22 state capital request in front of the legislature this session. As a reminder, the initial state request was approved in October and later amended at the December board meeting to incorporate the university's supplemental request. The state request represents 82% of the total FY23 annual capital budget, or $854 million of the $1 billion, just over $1 billion request. If there is no bill, the FY23 annual capital budget would total $188 million. There's a lot to look at in this slide, but it's an important one and one I get a chance to talk to you about once or twice a year. As a reminder of our status of our funding, our current built infrastructure. Facility renewal is a recurring, consistent, and predictable problem. Our buildings need maintenance, systems wear out. Routine reinvestment is important to maximize our investment in the buildings that we own and operate. What this chart illustrates is that we rely on largely unpredictable sources of funding to meet that need, HEAPR and the state capital request. The 2 gray lines represent facility renewal targets. The lower gray line represents the minimum funding needed to not lose ground on our facility care and upkeep. The upper gray line is the target to actually make progress and reduce our $5.1 billion facility renewal need over the next 10 years. Annual stewardship, or the maroon bars, represent state-funded HEAPR plus university-funded repair and replacement. Asset reinvestment, or the gold bars, represent all the other facility renewal that are standalone projects funded by the state capital request and internally university-funded renovations. The FY23 bar includes renewal investments that are part of the active state capital request. That is HEAPR and chemistry, Fraser, and others. For the past several years, the University of Minnesota has requested $200 million of HEAPR because that is our annual need. This year, an additional $200 million of HEAPR was added with the supplemental request that would help buy down the deferred renewal amassed from underfunding previous years. HEAPR's role in maintaining the safety and functionality of our campus cannot really be overstated. The university takes its facility stewardship role very seriously. The university creates and maintains buildings to support our teaching, research, and service mission. This requires safe, modern, functional facilities. HEAPR and R&R funds play a critical role in providing faculty, staff, and students with the facilities necessary to conduct their work. HEAPR is the largest single source of funding available for making the not always noticed but vital capital improvements to campus buildings and infrastructure. The capital budget is composed of line item or separate named and funded projects. This slide shows the major projects funded both by the state request and those funded wholly by the university. Projects and totals will be, again, adjusted in June based upon the outcome of the state request. This project slide is just to identify one of the one project of size that the university is funding outside of the state request. This project has been in process for a number of years and was funded for design by the board in last year's annual capital budget, and is here just to point out the one major project outside of the state request. The capital budget also includes pools of funds for renewal, HEAPR being the state-funded pools and the university-funded repair and replacement pools, which are shown on the slide. These are funds that are used to tackle many projects such as elevator upgrades, HVAC, mechanical equipment replacement, parking lot resurfacing, LED lighting, and so forth. Projects within these pools can move up or down in priority based upon the criticality, cost efficiency to be gained from other projects underway, and gives us flexibility to adapt as we operate. You can see that the good planning that happens across by many campuses and by many different business lines incorporated in their planning is for facility renewal and upgrade. I point you here to a few projects that you may see added to the capital budget in June or at some point during the year as a capital budget amendment. These are projects that we're currently working on but have not yet completed their pre-design or resolved its full funding to be included in the capital budget. This final slide provides a summary of the funding sources for the projects included in the annual capital improvement budget. Local, or that is collegiate and unit funds, gifts, institutional dollars, and university debt both altogether fund the university 1/3 of state-funded projects as well as other university funds. As a reminder, this includes the full value of the 22 state capital request. With that, I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Any discussion? Regent McMillan?
Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thank you, Vice President Bertelsen. Back to slide 38, which is the facility investment versus target. And when I look at the $5 billion number, which is obviously aspirational in nature, we don't probably ever think we'll find all of that $5 billion. Is there, yeah, there it is, thank you. When I think about that number and I think about I believe it's annual, we get a facility assessment report, which has red, pink, green coloration in it, depending on how new or old and how severe the issues are.
Mm-hmm.
Would there be a way, to take that $5 billion and grade it accordingly with colors? I mean, there's probably some in that $5 billion that let's take Eddie Hall, for instance, something that's, 150 years old, maybe not that old, but give or take. We probably don't have a realistic expectation of that getting funded anytime soon. Could you grade that? And then would we have a $2 billion shortfall for buildings that are, really critical? I'm trying to put some reality around that number without disrespecting the fact that we really own all those facilities. And, but does that make sense?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
And Regent McMillan. Yes, it does. And so one of the ways that we've approached that very topic is we've built what we call the building by building strategy. So because we know not every building is meant to stay here forever. There's a time, some like Eddie Hall, building number 1 is one that we'll find at some point, find a way to upgrade and keep because it's that deeply built into our fabric of our history of the institution. Other buildings do not have that. And we've actually identified as do not invest, do not renew and we spend enough money there to make it a safe building for people who are still operating it because that's our responsibility for those people. But we are actively working on ways to get out of that building. As an example, the largest by sure is Mayo. Nearly 1 million square feet of space, enormous chunk of the deferred renewal, but one that we do not, we are actively working to figure out solutions to get out of. So yeah, I think we have not calculated, I think, the deferred renewal number as quite as you said, but we could take a shot at that.
Quick follow-up.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Just for the record, I'm not anti-Eddie Hall. Let's use Mayo as a better example. One, it's DNR, DNI.
The State Historical Preservation Office thanks you.
Yes, yes, yes. I was a bad example. You gave me a good one. So it's that DNI, DNR list that I was kind of thinking about a number
Yeah.
for that. And that would cut into that 5 billion, right?
Mhm.
All right. I don't need that now. I don't know if I ever need it. It helps me frame it. Thank you.
Thank you. Student Representative Mergendal.
Hi, I'm looking at, I think it's 42 on the docket, the repair and replacement pools. Noticing, good old Morris down at the very bottom. Can you talk a little bit about how decisions are made for setting these pools for the system campuses? What sort of consultation happens with administration, with students, faculty, staff, other stakeholders there?
Sure. Madam Chair, and members. So the repair and replacement funds are built into each unit's operating budget. So the, how much that is there as part of the each campus's annual operating budget conversation with the institution. So there's not an annual decision about how much money to give to a campus out of a central pool. It's been built up over many years. So there was an R&R pool before I started here 28 years ago on each campus. And then decisions to grow or shrink that have been made by campuses as part of their annual operating budget discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. And so really, I'm just looking for some clarification. I understand that we won't know for a while what, if anything, the legislature will do. But the way I understand what you're saying is that regardless of what they do, when we come back for action on this, there will be the repair and replacement pool of that'll be in there.
Yes.
And ask for that approval. Also, the way I understood is that the offsite collection facility, which is 62.7, that will also be in there. So those two things are going to come forward regardless of the legislative. And then depending on what the legislature does, some of the other things may or may not come. Is that the right way to think about this?
Yes, Madam Chair and Regent Powell. And the other line items on this slide in front of you now that don't say state next to them. So
okay.
There's also Moose Lab renovations.
Okay.
The ice refrigerant project, Dwan Lab renovation, and a McNeil Suite renovation. So
okay.
Those pools
Yep.
and these non-state line items would all proceed.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, to understand, with the capital request in our operating budget appropriation together. So looking at that same, the slide that Regent McMillan identified with, so if am I understanding this right, that the maroon portion, that's money that the state is providing on an annual basis. Like, so in fiscal year 19, it was over 50 million, 21, it was over 50 million. And then other years it's been a little bit less than that. Is that money from the state in addition to our operating budget appropriation?
Which slide are you referring to, Regent
I
Rocha?
think it looks like
It's
38.
slide 38.
Okay, thank you.
Regent Rocha, yes, that's right. So both the maroon and there's some state money and some university money in each of those colors. But yes, together. So the annual are things that we see as more routine steward, kind of the pools, HEAPR plus R&R. And then the gold is sort of the individual buildings that we would do. So it's like a Pillsbury Hall would fall under the gold. So the HEAPR eligible component of that building counts as toward the renewal. Am I saying that? I made it more confusing. I'm sorry.
I'm just trying to understand. So, because so ultimately, like for instance, in the FY23 number with with the substantial ask, I just kind of pointing out. So,
right.
In addition to what is $690.7 million in an operating appropriation from the legislature, we're asking for another $685.6 million. We're asking the legislature to give us $1.4 billion this year. So it really is a partnership with with state leadership to get these things done. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Regent Hipsch?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just walk us through, if you could, if we don't do the 400 million, if we don't get $400 million, let's just say. I mean, like at home, if I don't shingle my house and my roof falls in, it costs me more than the 30,000 the shingles would have cost, right? So I mean, what happens to us as a university? And since we've been underfunding this for so long, how come our roofs aren't collapsing?
Well,
Madam Chair, I think my boss wants to answer that question.
all right, you take that, Senior Vice President.
Madam Chair, Regent Hipsch, yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one. Well, the reason that the roofs aren't falling in is because of the great services, of the people who work for Vice President Mike Burleson.
Thank you so much for that.
Well, it's true because, yes, the roofs get old and they can eventually fall in, but they don't always fall in past their useful life. Sometimes they will. So I think the key that what we try to do at the university and with Vice President Burleson's team is with loving, tender care, keep every building working as long as we possibly can. There are ways to do that, right? That are not full replacement or and doing the new roof. So you do what you can to keep things going, but you can only do that for so long. But that strategy has been employed forever here. And, we really believe at the university on the operations side that we need to, we owe the university, we owe the state and the students and the staff safe, vibrant places to live and work and learn and do research, and safe places too. So I will tell you though, it weighs heavily. I know it does on Vice President Burleson and myself, this backlog and the list of things to get done. So we try to make sure we avoid the catastrophes, but the catastrophes can happen. I'm sure that Vice President Burleson can tell us about when a roof came in when we didn't want it to. So, but that's why, we continue to be able to operate what we operate is because of the care we put into it. But that's a limited strategy, as you can imagine.
The only thing I would add is that I think one of the things we do, we do certainly have a priority upon which we're, with the limited renewal funds that we have a priority, and roofs are at the top of that list because for the very reasons you identify, Regent, that if we don't take care of that, so the building exterior and then you sort of work in. So what over time has happened is the building's capacity to support program continues to be more and more limited. But we do prioritize roofs and have a very good roof annual inspection program and prioritize those projects.
Any follow-up, Regent?
Oh, just to be clear, thanks, Madam Chair. Just to be clear, I'm all for HEAPR money. I think it's very important, and I think that the state legislature needs to get on board with not only HEAPR money in higher ed, but also in K-12 and roads, bridges, everything else. So it's a good use of surplus money. So thank you.
Thank you. Regent Kenyanya?
Thank you, Madam Chair, VP Bertelsen. Do we see the recently issued bonds playing a role here? And apologies if I missed it. Are those funds we look to use to tackle this so those roofs stay up? Regent Hipsch?
Madam Chair, I will start and then I'm sure SVP Franz can add to the financing pieces of it. I think mostly what those bonds do is give the university a predictable rate upon which we can use to fund the projects that we were likely planning to fund during this 6-year plan. So we issue the debt, we have the availability of it, but we still have to pay back that debt. So we are more than ready to spend as much money as the institution and the state are willing to come up with resources to fund, and we're prepared to do that. But it's really more of a financial capacity, and I think SVP Franz may have more to add.
Senior Vice President Franz.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Regent Kenyanya. I think one of the things we have seen is that typically and we'll talk about this a little bit later on today, typically for projects that we fund in part or in whole, we go out and sell bonds and use those bonds for that particular project. And we now know with the rising interest rates, what we're looking at over the horizon for the next number of years. And so what we've tried to do is really pre-fund the 6-year plan, as Vice President Bertelsen said. So we have access to resources at a interest rate that we think will be advantageous for us going forward. So in fact, that was one of the things we talked to the credit rating agencies about. They wanted to know, was the $500 million interest-only bond sale, was that a different taking on of additional risk by the university? We really said no. What it really is doing is eliminating some of the risk, be able to secure those funds for the next 5 to 6 years. So that's the strategy we're trying to come up with.
Any follow-up, Regent Kenyally?
No, that was helpful. And just to rephrase it, make sure I'm understanding, on a project basis, it doesn't change anything for the unit. It's just they get to go to this pool instead, which is still debt that they have to budget for and pay for. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much for the presentation. Good discussion, good questions. And with that, we will move on to the third item on our agenda. And that third item is review of the President's recommended fiscal year 2023 annual operating budget. The board will act on the operating budget at our June meeting, June 12th and 13th. Until then, we'll be collecting feedback on the budget from the university community. The board launched an online feedback form to collect comments from the community. You can visit the board's website, regents.umn.edu, to submit your comments. The online comment period will close at 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, May 31. Input received during the comment period will be included in the June Finance and Operations Committee meeting docket and become part of the official public record. The name and affiliation of the commenter will also be included. Additionally, we will hold a public forum on the operating budget tomorrow, beginning at 8 a.m. Sign up will take place from 7:30 a.m. to 8 a.m. in the West Committee Room. 15 speaker slots will be available on a first come, first served basis. During the forum, speakers will be called upon in the order of sign up and will have 3 minutes to make comments. Now, at this time, let me welcome Senior Vice President Franz again and Vice President Tonneson to introduce the operating budget. Senior Vice President Franz, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, Vice Chair McMillan, and members of the committee. For your review today, Vice President Tonneson and I are going to present the President's recommended operating budget for fiscal 2023. And in our world, it just doesn't get much more exciting than this, right?
Scary, but true.
But I want to take this opportunity before we jump into the details that Vice President Tonneson will walk us through to give a little oversight as we get into this, because it is a complex set of facts. The materials, as you now know, in your document materials are voluminous, and there are a lot of schedules, and Vice President Tonneson will walk that through. But I want to start off by reminding us all that budgets are both financial documents and value-driven documents. Clearly, the math must work, and that's what Vice President Tonneson and our entire team has worked on. But the budget also reflects the values that we place on our mission at the university. These values are derived from Impact 2025, the plan that we have invested in to guide our work and our priorities. The President's recommended operating budget for fiscal 23 includes $4.2 billion in revenues and $4.1 billion in expenditures. The operating balance is a result of conservative budget estimating based upon the continued phase-in of activities as the university emerges from the pandemic, and also the acknowledgement of potential additional inflationary pressures on expenditures that are not currently known, but certainly expected over the course of the next year. There are 4 key factors that really impact our revenue estimates relevant to this next fiscal year. First, we have an expected decrease of about $25 million in sponsored research funds. Second, we have general increases ranging from 3.5% to 5% have been applied to miscellaneous revenues such as sales, gifts, endowment earnings, and fees to reflect expected growth in activity and or rates. Third, we've included $2.5 million of the fiscal year 22 state appropriation in the recommended allocations for fiscal 23. This appropriation was uncommitted until now. Fourth, we've included the recommended tuition rate increases, which are all below the rates of inflation that we'll walk through in detail. In addition, the revenue projections, this budget includes $28 million in internal reallocation of resources. Once again, this is cutting expenses to redeploy existing revenues to new priorities. And as we will explain in more detail, we are recommending the use of $8.5 million in central reserves as a bridge for some key components of the budget that we'll describe in detail. Now, moving to a summary of the spending side, I'd like to review several factors. First, we propose an investment in our talent to support Impact 2025 goals through a 3.85% general merit pool increase for our employees. General increases in the range of 3% to 5% for other operating costs. We propose a slight reduction in student aid expenditures as the significant federal pandemic relief for students ended in fiscal 22. We have relatively low increases in overall facility-related costs compared to fiscal 22. And finally, we are proposing some additional recurring investments in Impact 2025, including implementation of the PEAK initiative, public safety enhancements, system-wide enrollment initiatives, and $7 million through a one-time transfer from the University of Minnesota Foundation to the President's office, specifically to advance the strategic plan, Impact 2025. Overall, the university is in a stable financial position emerging from the pandemic, with only some units facing enrollment or other revenue challenges, which will be strategically addressed over the next year. While it is challenging to build a budget that achieves strategic goals and advances the university's excellence in the face of rising costs and limited revenue growth, this budget, we believe, successfully addresses key priorities shared by the President and the Board of Regents. Before I turn it over to Vice President Tonneson, I want to take one moment to review the process that we go through to get here today. Many of you are aware of this, but some of you are not. First, to provide a structure for analyzing and understanding the budget. Many years ago, the university created what we call Resource Responsibility Centers, or happily referred to by most as RRCs. There are 50 of them today, and each campus system is an RRC. Each Twin Cities college or major academic unit is one. Additionally, there are a number of support units with that designation, most of those units have system-wide responsibilities, either in total or in part. Each RRC was designated based on the organizational structure and the accountability assigned to that leader, rather than the size or the complexity of the unit's budget. For example, each campus system campus chancellor has been given responsibility and accountability for the full campus budget by the president and the dean. And the dean of each college, Twin Cities College, is held accountable for the financial health of the college. There is no budget for the Twin Cities campus as a separate unit in our process. Each RRC receives annual budget instructions and has the same access to the budget process. As part of that process, we meet with all 50 units. This is an opportunity for RRC leaders to bring forward their financial priorities, their concerns, and questions to the president for her consideration. The Budget 5 committee consists of me in my capacity as senior vice president, the provost, the vice president for clinical academic affairs, the vice president for research, and the budget director. 5 people. Each of us approaches this work as an institutional officer. That is a requirement of participation. It is our job to understand the budget and then synthesize that information to make recommendations on priorities all across the academic and support functions. We provide the president with rationale for our recommendations, and we present options to her along the way. We also share with her issues or requests from the units that we are not recommending be included in the budget to ensure that she is well aware and well informed of what the university community is facing before making her final decisions how to finalize her recommendations. For example, the allocation of the state appropriation is one of the items we recommend to the president in this process. We do not distribute the state appropriation based on a single metric or any kind of formula. Instead, it is a subjective decision based on assessment of many intersecting variables, and they're also interesting. It is made on an incremental basis, last year's base plus or minus specific amounts tied to discrete decisions. Now, we also make recommendations on a whole host of other budget items, including fee proposals, tuition rate proposals, movement of activities within the university, reallocation levels by each unit, and so forth. All of us must come together in a way that balances the budget and makes each unit as successful as possible. And the result of that complex process, members of the committee, here is what we have to bring for you today, is this recommended operating budget on behalf of the President for fiscal year 23. Madam Chair, with your permission, I'll turn it over to Vice President Tonneson to present in more detail the recommended budget.
Thank you. Vice President Tonneson.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Senior Vice President Franz, for that introduction. We wanted to start today by grounding us all in what exactly we're talking about within the overall budgeting process. At the beginning of the capital budget presentation, Senior Vice President Franz described our annual budgets in the context of the biennial request to the state, so I won't repeat that here. I'll just point out that generally we think about development of the operating budget in 4 parts or phases. The first being planning, forecasting, and modeling, which actually happens prior to what you see on this graphic. The second phase is then the biennial budget request to the state. Then parts 3 and 4 involve our annual budgets within the biennium, budgets that necessarily incorporate the state appropriation, plus all other funds and activities that make up the remaining 80 to 85% of our budget. Today, we're talking about the 4th part in that structure, FY23, which is the 2nd annual budget within the current biennium. It starts July 1 and ends June 30, 2023. As soon as the budget is enacted for FY23, we will begin the next cycle for the 24-25 biennium. As Senior Vice President Fran mentioned, the supplemental request to the state that you approved and we submitted for the 2022 legislative process is not incorporated into this recommended budget. It was constructed to be truly supplemental, which means that we can and have prepared a recommended budget that does not depend on anything we asked for in the supplemental request. So what exactly is in the all funds budget? I realize there's a lot of detailed information in the budget materials that we feel is important to document as part of the approval process. So while much of the information today does repeat what's in that documentation, our intent is to highlight the pieces we feel provide the best summary of what we are asking you to approve next month. Starting with the revenues, the pie chart for FY23 incorporating the President's recommendations as well as estimates of ongoing activity looks very similar to that of recent years. The total projected revenues of $4.2 billion are distributed across the restricted, auxiliary, and unrestricted categories as pictured here. 40% of the budget will come from the O&M state appropriation and tuition combined. That's the same proportion as in the current year. All revenues combined, excluding internal sales and the federal higher education emergency relief funds, are projected to be up approximately $75 million from this year. Sponsored grants are projected to drop $25 million due to reduced COVID-specific activity, while all the other funds combined are projected to increase approximately $100 million. The assumptions we have built into the projections for other funds include what you see here. In general, for most of our unrestricted and restricted other funds, we are projecting growth in the 3.5% to 5% range, which exceeds the levels of increase we've experienced in recent years and is even above those years just prior to the pandemic. This is in large part because we're moving from an abnormally low base and spreading that, quote, return to normal over a period of several years. Some specific components in these totals will go up at even higher rates, but they are coupled with components that are more stable, resulting in the overall growth range of that 3.5% to 5%. I do want to mention here that 2 categories actually show a decrease for next year on attachment 1, which is the all funds fiscal page summarizing the budget in numbers form. On that page, you will see that the non-sponsored restricted category will decrease as the federal relief aid is eliminated. But if you set aside the impact those federal dollars have had on our reports for the last 3 years, that category is actually projected to be up 3.5% from FY20 as well. And finally, as we've mentioned, the sponsored grant projection shows a decrease as there will be that drop off in COVID-specific grants. Moving to the high-level expenditure projections, total expenditures of roughly $4.1 billion are estimated to be up 2.9% from the current year, an increase of roughly $115 million excluding internal sales. They're displayed here by functional category in the pie chart, and that distribution across the categories really doesn't change appreciably from year to year. There are a few takeaway items in these numbers and changes compared to FY22. First, as reflected on attachment 1, you would see that projected spending on salaries is up 4%. which reflects the recommended salary plan, which we'll discuss on an upcoming slide, and the general expectation of additional retention issues, net new hires, and other types of miscellaneous adjustments. Plus, the cost of fringe benefits is expected to grow 15% from this year due to the abnormally low fringe rates in FY22 as a result of the pandemic swings in healthcare costs. Outside of salary and fringe categories, the expenditure side of the budget reflects growth levels of 3 to 4% by category. This is under the rate of inflation for a couple of reasons. As we talked about at a previous meeting earlier this year, the impact of inflation varies by unit and activity, and their response to extraordinary cost growth in the units is often to buy less or buy differently. So the level of spending is held down automatically by their decisions to remain within budget. And second, the impact of reallocations is sprinkled throughout these categories as well, which also holds down the cost growth. And finally, the projection of sponsored grant activity on the expenditure side matches that of the revenues, down 25 million or 3.6% due to the drop-off of COVID-specific grants. Very quickly, that overall growth of 2.9% does not stand out really when you view the annual year-over-year change in expenditures. What does stand out when you look across the years is the variability of these rates of change. Expenditures tend to be more volatile in a couple of categories, particularly in equipment and purchase of professional services or contracts. If a year with a large one-time purchase follows one without such purchases, the change can be a high rate of growth, as you see in FY16 here. Then the following year will show a low rate of growth comparatively if those one-time expenditures don't continue, which you also see then in FY17. FY21 reflects the pandemic and our significantly reduced activities. And I can say I think I have not ever seen an actual reduction in total expenditures one year to the next in all the years I've been here. But that means even estimating the current year to FY22 at levels that still remain below normal, it shows as a large growth swing up of 5% because last year was so low. The other piece of information on this slide speaks to the areas of spending that traditionally see rates of inflation that often can exceed the typical CPI reported rates. Again, these occur differentially across our units and we manage them in different ways. We can return to that conversation if you like, but we have thought about and incorporated plans to handle inflation within the budget before you today. Finally, from an overview perspective, we thought it would be useful to connect the dots a bit in terms of the all funds budget that I just walked through on the past slides and the more in-depth conversation we will have about the funds and investments in what we call the budget framework. This picture is a way of viewing the whole budget. I'm going to start in the middle with the gold box. These are the resources we bring to your attention throughout the year and ultimately make decisions about as we develop the budget. You've heard me talk about the fact that we need to decide what to ask for from the state of Minnesota and that we can't do that in a vacuum. We also have to decide what to plan for tuition rates and how much of their state and tuition funds we want to ask our units to reallocate. And then we always have this extra category at the bottom called other unit revenues. Now, moving over to the left column under the other revenues heading, you will see the non-state and non-tuition funds that the units generate differentially based on their activities. We hold our leaders and financial managers accountable for balancing the budgets in those funds. So the first goal of each of those funds is to grow enough to cover the cost increases for the activities that are currently paid for by those funds. For example, if today indirect cost recovery revenue on sponsored grants is covering departmental support costs for developing grant proposals, the first call on growth in that revenue is to pay the compensation cost increases for the staff doing that work, to pay and cover any inflationary costs on the supplies and materials they need to do that work, and to support any other enhancements to their processes or methods. And the list goes on revenue source by revenue source. Keeping in mind that some of these sources are restricted to particular purposes, so that must be managed as well. If any of this revenue in particular places is unrestricted and growing beyond what is needed to do what I just described, then it comes to the table to combine with the other resources in the gold box to help pay for what you see in blue. because those same cost items exist in the activities supported by the state appropriation and tuition. The state appropriation and tuition need to grow to cover compensation cost increases, priority initiatives, inflation, facility needs, et cetera. And if they don't grow enough, or we choose to temper their growth, we force reallocations and we leverage that available growth in the other funds from the left column where we can in order to pay for the things in blue. The other revenues on the far left supplement on the margin and where appropriate the plans for state appropriations and tuition, but their growth has not been large enough or consistent enough to take the place of the need for growth in the extremely important state and tuition dollars. The result of going through the review of each item on this slide and making decisions along the way through the process that Senior Vice President Franz outlined for you at the beginning of this discussion is what you have before you in the form of a full recommended budget package for FY23. The estimates of revenues and spending for funds in the left column are included in the total budget on attachment 1 and in the slides that I just talked through. The proposals for the gold and the blue boxes are as well. In the next part of this presentation, then, we will lay out the decisions we've made in the gold and the blue box areas, our recommendations for the budget framework items as part of that full budget package. In summary, and we'll dig into these in a bit more detail on upcoming slides, the new incremental spending of $87 million, the blue box for FY23, can be described in 3 categories. $64.2 million for the next investment in the system-wide strategic plan. That's for compensation and for unit level initiatives. $20 million for core needs that differ within units, just to keep the operation moving. And $2.8 million, a relatively low amount this year, for facility and technology infrastructure cost increases. On the resource side, how we propose to pay for that incremental $87 million of spending, just over $50 million, or 58% of the total, would come from essentially what is not growth in state and tuition resources. That includes reallocations, accessing the other revenues, and unit and central balances for bridging. Then $34.5 million, or 40% of the total, would come from our recommendations and estimates related to tuition, and just $2.5 million, the final 2%, would come from available state appropriations. So let's spend just a bit more time on the revenue side of the framework first. We'll start on the resource side with an explanation of the other revenues and the internal reallocations. That's $41.6 million of the $50 million in non-state and non-tuition resources I just mentioned. I'll come back to that remaining $8.5 million to get to 50 in a moment. Within other revenues, there are 3 types we traditionally turn to. For FY23, units proposed to dedicate $9.7 million of available growth in other revenues to cover cost growth reflected in the framework. This primarily includes uncommitted endowment earnings for positions and growth in the unrestricted indirect cost recovery funds associated with sponsored grants. This is the piece of the far left column on slide 8 that we just talked through as it flows into the gold box on that slide. In addition, 9 units will have tuition revenues coming in above budget this year, FY22, totaling a recurring $3.6 million. These revenues were unanticipated and have not been committed to recurring expenses, so they can be applied to FY23 costs. These dollars are not associated with the rate changes or the enrollment swings projected for next year. That amount, that $34.5 million on the summary, is over and above accessing this $3.6 million. And finally, we're planning just $200,000 in one-time O&M balances in units that will provide a bridge to future revenue increases or savings. In addition to other revenues, we're planning $28.1 million of internal budget cuts and reallocations. As this chart shows, the level of internal repurposing of existing resources through deliberate decisions to eliminate or reduce spending remains at a significant level for FY23. As noted, this chart shows only recurring reallocations in state and tuition funds as the primary sources of support for our core operations. So it does not include unit decisions to reduce spending in response to inadequate levels of growth in those other revenues. I also want to note that each of the years represented on this chart is one without a reduction in state appropriations, so they are comparable in that regard. The roughly $28 million of planned spending reductions represents an average across all units of 1.4%. higher than 6 of the last 8 years, with the 2 highest being FY16, when we created a strategic investment pool solely through a special reallocation, and FY22 as we plan to adjust to the post-COVID, or I would say mid-COVID world. The reductions in support units average 1%, ranging from 0 to 2.75%, and the reductions in academic units average 1.8%, ranging from 0.7 to 5.8%, with the majority actually implementing a 1.4% reallocation. Based on early responses from units, we're expecting 25% of these reductions to come from position eliminations, 35% from salary savings due to turnover and position restructuring, and 40% from reductions to non-compensation items, supplies, travel, equipment, and so forth. Our planning process asked each unit to propose actions that would result in spending reductions of 1.4%, but then each unit's individual circumstances were reviewed before arriving at the specific level proposed for each. We reviewed their specific financial issues and challenges, the tools available to address those challenges, priorities in concert with the institution, and the impact of the proposed spending reductions they brought forward. In addition to these unit level resources for FY23, we also have a plan to use central resources on a one-time basis to bridge some significant costs. This is that remaining $8.5 million to get us back to the 50 on the previous slide. The Crookston, Duluth, and Morris campuses were hit pretty hard this year with enrollment-driven tuition shortfalls. After factoring in that revenue loss compared to budget and the increasing costs each campus faces for compensation and items unique to them, each campus was left with a significant shortfall to balance their recurring needs. Each is planning to reallocate at least 1.4%, but to address the remaining shortfall after that 1.4% reduction on a relatively short planning timeframe would force additional cuts and would be very problematic. As a result, our recommendation is to provide non-recurring bridging funds totaling $7.4 million to balance their budgets for 1 year. As part of this recommendation, we will set up teams, institutional and campus leaders in partnership to generate options to reduce costs or grow revenues, to troubleshoot barriers to implementing solutions, to regularly monitor actual activity, all with the goal of developing a concrete plan for action before we embark on the FY24 budget development process this winter. A second significant need for which we recommend the use of bridging funds is the payment of debt service on the Masonic Institute for the Developing Brain facility. That facility has been designed with an expanded model of shared or collaborative spaces, so we simply need more time to develop a thoughtful and strategic distribution of the costs across the types of units that might access that space over time. The funding model will be determined prior to FY24. Our proposal to address these recurring costs on a one-time basis in FY23 is to access uncommitted central balances of $1.5 million and to implement a new idea to leverage recent earnings on the endowment for the remaining $7 million. Which brings us to the next slide specifically about this proposal. In FY07, the institution created an unrestricted quasi-endowment within the Consolidated Endowment Fund, within CEF, using $120 million of funds in the Temporary Investment Pool, TIP. As you remember, TIP is made up of the institution's cash on hand on any given day. You can think of it as the sum of all the unit level balances that exist as a so-called checkbook balance each day. TIP has consistently been invested for the short term to earn better than what a bank account would, but still allowing the funds to be accessed for cash flow purposes. It generates about a 2.5% return right now, but it was determined in FY07 that not all of the $1 billion in TIP at that time was needed for short-term liquidity, and we could safely move a portion of it to an unrestricted quasi-endowment in CEF with the sole purpose of maximizing investment returns that support central reserves. So $120 million was moved at that time. This has proven to be a very successful strategy. In the last 2 years, with a current book value of approximately $135 million, the market value of that portion of TIP investment in CEF has grown to just over $200 million. Our proposal is to withdraw 25 million of the gain in market value as one-time revenue to central reserves to support the 3 items you see listed under box B on this slide. The 7 million I just described for Crookston, Duluth, and Morris, the $8 million necessary to fund the principal reserve on the recent $500 million bond sale. And at this time, we're recommending we set aside $10 million for an estimate of the one-time costs of peak implementation over the next 2 to 3 years. And I'll return to that idea in a few slides. With this proposal, the majority of the market value gain on this quasi-endowment will remain in SEF, producing the annual 4.5% return to central reserves. But this new opportunity to access a portion of the recent positive investment returns is one we feel we should leverage for these important needs. If any portion of this 25 million is not needed for the purposes identified, we would return it to central reserves. Moving now to the second largest source of resources for the FY23 framework, tuition revenue, you can see from this slide that there are a number of components that make up the estimated 34.5 million gain in our proposal. The largest portion at 17.4 million would come from the recommended 3.5% increase in the resident and non-resident undergraduate and graduate rates on the Twin Cities and Rochester campuses. Both campuses are experiencing high demand and strong enrollment potential. The recommendation for the Crookston, Duluth, and Morris campuses is for a 1.75% increase in recognition of the continuing struggle these campuses are having in maintaining enrollment. The third category of revenue associated with rate changes is that for the variety of departmental master's and certificate programs and the professional programs, each arriving at a rate proposal based on an assessment of market comparisons and enrollment demand. Attachment 2 to the budget details the specific rates in this category. There is also a component of the tuition revenue increase based on enrollment. 13 units are expecting at least a small amount of growth, while 10 are expecting declines, with the net change being slightly positive. And the final components of the tuition revenue change relate to the tuition surcharge that impacts students in 4 colleges today: the Carlson School of Management, the College of Science and Engineering, or CSE, on the Twin Cities campus, students with CSE majors enrolled in the College of Liberal Arts on the Twin Cities campus, and the Swenson College of Science and Engineering on the Duluth campus. It will be the final year of the phase-in by cohort for the CSE-based students and the second of 4 years of a cohort phase-in plan for the Swenson College, which is not a recommended change. The additional 3.3 million is simply the result of the planned and previously approved phase-in. But in addition to that, this budget proposes to increase the Twin Cities-based surcharges from $1,000 per semester to $1,250 per semester. The Carlson surcharge began in FY12 and has not been changed or adjusted in the years since. Because it is beneficial for communication and administrative purposes to keep the surcharge consistent on the campus, this recommendation is for both Carlson and CSE, both of which are experiencing high demand for their programs. The net new revenue after need-based scholarships to offset the surcharge in full would be $3.1 million. And that 3.1 million would be directed into programming and services within those colleges to support MPACT 2025 by addressing capacity issues in teaching, facility improvements, and enhancements to curriculum. The schools have reviewed their differential fees compared to peers and or other Big Ten schools this year, and it is apparent that their rankings, both in terms of the differential itself and in terms of total cost, would not change with the addition in the surcharge. A summary of the tuition rates without the surcharge is displayed on this table. It's difficult to identify a single dollar impact when there are so many different scenarios of student experience and characteristics, but it is worth noting that for a large number of students eligible for next year's increases in Pell and the Minnesota State Grant Program, all or a significant portion of the tuition increase will be offset by the increased aid. That's for 11 to 12,000 students across the system, which is an average of about 35% of our resident undergraduates. As I mentioned previously, the change in professional and special graduate and certificate program rates varies by individual program, and all of those rates for this year and proposed for next year are detailed in attachment 2 to the budget beginning on page 89 of your docket materials. In addition to the tuition rate changes, this budget incorporates a variety of changes in student fees. As occurs every year, we reviewed each proposed change to academic, course, and miscellaneous fees to ensure they are consistent with board policy. They are detailed in attachments 7, 8, and 9 to the budget. I want to mention that many of these fees do not cover the full expenses of the materials or activities that they support. The units must use state and tuition revenues to cover a portion of the costs as well. In addition, we ask the departments to examine their activities to determine and then reflect changes in practice post-COVID. Some instructors have added or changed experiments or field trip experiences and so forth. So this list is highly curated every year. The second category of fees is the mandatory student services fees. This category is governed by a separate Board of Regents policy that calls for student-led processes on each campus to review and ultimately recommend fee levels for a variety of activities. For FY23, you see the result of those processes in the gold table. In large part, these changes reflect increases in costs, but there are also some student-supported service enhancements. A pilot student legal services program at UMD, and an increase in student mental health services on the Twin Cities campus, for example. Finally, as we have reported to you, our student housing and dining programs were some of the most severely impacted operations on each campus during the pandemic. And now they're facing significant cost increases for labor, some utilities, and particularly food. The rate changes proposed for FY23 included in the blue table here are generally for a double room and an unlimited meal plan for consistency, but the actual experience can definitely differ by student. The projections for occupancy in housing vary some, but are moving back up. We're projecting 65% occupancy at Morris all the way up to 94% on the Twin Cities campus. In no case do these rate changes begin to replenish the loss of balances or depreciation reserves that these units spent down during the pandemic. And in many cases, they will not even cover the costs we are estimating for FY23. So balances will need to be accessed one more time. So putting it all together, the tuition rate changes, the mandatory fee increases, and the room and board increases for a full-time resident undergraduate student living on campus with an unlimited meal plan, a lot of qualifiers there, the cost increase will range from roughly 2.5% to 4.5% depending on the campus. These are all below the current rates of inflation, which is really possible due to the bullets that you see in the box on this slide. In order to keep the increases at these levels, the university is proposing in this budget to increase compensation by less than the rate of inflation, to force units to do what they can to buy less or buy differently, meaning find the deals, to force units to cut their budgets, to reallocate by eliminating positions or stop doing something, and to grow other revenues wherever possible to fill in the gaps. And I would add here, this will also involve spending down of balances in some cases. And again, I want to note that for students that are eligible, the combined increase in federal and state financial assistance will offset anywhere from 25% to 45% of these full increases. So where are we in summarizing the budget? I just talked through each of the framework resource variables on this summary slide. And this is actually a repeat of slide 11, just to reground us a bit on where we're at. The incremental 87.1 million of resources in the budget comes from the unit reallocations of roughly 28 million, the growth in other revenues and use of unit and central balances of roughly 22 million, so that's the 50. The growth in tuition revenue from the various changes we walked through, and then the 2.5 million of state appropriation that we received recurring beginning in FY22, but that we didn't commit yet. So it's available for spending in FY23. Those are the framework resources. Notice I didn't mention the fees or room and board rates as part of that 87 million, and that's because those are part of the quote other revenues portion of the budget, way over on the left column of that previous slide, that must be balanced outside of the framework. So now let's move to a brief summary of what we proposed allocating the 87 million of framework resources to. First and foremost, the priority for this budget is to invest in the strategic plan by investing in our talented faculty and staff. We cannot move forward in any meaningful way with Impact 2025 without making this investment. Going back even further than this graphic depicts, the proposed 3.85% general compensation pool increase, while below the rate of inflation, unfortunately, I believe is the highest planned for the institution in my tenure here, so back to the early 90s. And it certainly exceeds what we have been able to provide since FY10, a period of 12 years in which we have had 3 different salary freezes of one sort or another, 9 years of 2 to 2.5% increases, which tried to keep pace with inflation, and 1 year that I will call COVID recovery with a 1.5% general increase. So the 3.85% stands out as a priority. Across all our funds, this increase is estimated to cost the institution $124 million, moving our total compensation spend from $2.4 billion this year to $2.5 billion next year. The combined impact of the 3.85% salary increase plus the fringe cost increase of roughly 15% leads to a projected 5.2% increase in total compensation costs. 20% of that cost will hit our sponsored grant activity, with the remaining 80% falling roughly equally to the state and tuition funds, and then to the collection of all other non-sponsored funds. The plan calls for distribution of the 3.85% on a merit basis for the non-labor represented employee groups, incorporating the need to make specific market-based adjustments where warranted within that overall pool. Beyond compensation, the investment plan, as detailed on attachment 3 to the budget, includes 4 categories of recurring spending. The single largest need in the budget outside of compensation is to cover the tuition revenue shortfall taking shape this year. Even with a large freshman class on the Twin Cities campus, there were declines in continuing student numbers, coupled with significant enrollment challenges at Crookston, Duluth, and Morris. So we're estimating to come in close to $15 million below budget across those units. This is a problem, because that $15 million was allocated to cover recurring costs this year. Therefore, as we move into FY23, we must make that up and cover those base costs. Although the negative swing is a large number, $15 million, I think it is worth noting that the tuition budget overall, when you factor in the $3.6 million of tuition over budget that we have in some units, was still 99% accurate. That's a good outcome, I think, in these times. Second, there are pockets throughout the university where units will be able to invest additional recurring funds into new or expanded initiatives to support Impact 2025. For this year, the budget included FY22. The budget included over $30 million of new investment in the plan. So that was really phase 1 during the biennium to get things jump-started. And I can report that units have responded strongly, and we are in the process of developing summaries or ways to report on how those dollars have been allocated. So as that movement is in process, this additional $13 million will supplement what is taking place, and we will continue to monitor how these resources are being deployed going forward. And then the last 2 categories here represent close to $8 million that will go toward a variety of infrastructure costs and operating needs. Included in this list are things like the increased costs of vendor agreements on our large technology systems, utility costs, structural imbalances in a couple of units, an increase in our institutional membership dues, increased library collection costs, and so on. Some of these make the list every year, while others represent an ever-changing group of unique but required budget adjustments. And finally, attachment 3 also identifies non-recurring investments, some of which we have already touched on today. The largest item is an early estimate for $15 million of costs over 3 to 4 years in implementing the PEAK initiative. That would be a mix of university personnel and miscellaneous expenses, as well as professional services. The expectation is that savings from the initiative will exceed this estimated implementation cost, but our proposal is to put in place $10 million of that $15 million right now from the withdrawal of earnings related to the TIP investment in CEF that I discussed earlier, so that we can focus the savings from the initiative into priority needs as those savings accrue over time. The second item here we have already discussed today. The third item is a wonderful opportunity for us, and Senior Vice President Franz mentioned this in his intro. The foundation has chosen to invest $7 million one time into strategic initiatives at the university. As part of this proposed budget, these funds will be managed and tracked and will supplement the funds university units are investing in the system-wide strategic plan. And then finally, just as on the recurring side, each year various non-recurring needs and issues arise through the budget process that we decide are urgent and need attention. This final $3.5 million includes items such as the bridge for MIDB debt service I mentioned previously today, a marketing plan for system-wide enrollment efforts, critical research equipment needs, and so forth. In closing, we believe the budget we have submitted for your review clearly supports the goals of Impact 2025. We're recommending significant support for our talented faculty and staff and additional programmatic or unit investments to support students through health and wellness, including mental health, through support for faculty, through curriculum development, and so on, to support public safety and workplace health and safety, to support our research and technology infrastructure. And underlying all of this, we're proposing a continued commitment to improve efficiencies and reprioritize the work that we do to help make these advancements even more impactful, which is also a part of Impact 2025. We also believe we're accomplishing this while incorporating a responsible tuition and fees plan and reasonable revenue and expenditure projections, resulting in a balanced budget. We cannot achieve the goals of Impact 2025 without these key components. Before we turn the discussion back to you, Chair Mayron, I would like to acknowledge the other members of my team who were instrumental in pulling this budget together. Lawrence Parson and Emily Larson are both in our larger audience today, and I would like to publicly thank them for their stellar work in getting us to this point. We are all now ready to engage in a conversation and answer any questions you may have on the budget. Thank you, Chair Mayron.
Thank you. Be careful what you wish for. Your wishes may come true. And with that, we will start. First question or individual who wants to engage in discussion is Regent Kenyanya. And by the way, before you begin, thank you, Vice President Tonneson, for a very comprehensive presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not used to going first. I usually steal ideas as I listen.
But we're going to steal from you now.
Yeah, okay. All right. Vice President Thompson, thank you so much for the detailed presentation. I'll start us off with a more big picture question rather than a question on a specific number. You walked us through the budget framework as you have at other times, and SVP Franz, when you were teeing it off, you talked about how it operates in an incremental nature and how that's been going on for a while. In a higher ed landscape that's changed a lot over the years, a university that's changed a lot, student body composition, colleges that have changed a lot. At what point does it make sense to revisit that? And I don't have subject matter expertise to suggest one way or another, but it seems even just for you and your team that it may be challenging to keep up with all those things happening around us at 1% to 3% every year. And certainly different units around the university will say the same thing, that the 1% to 3% throughout the years isn't meeting the needs of everything else happening around us. And we've seen places where tuition hasn't been that 1% to 3%, especially non-resident and whatnot throughout the years. State support has definitely changed. So it's a twofold. Well, no, it's not a twofold question, but it's in part for you. But then perhaps also a question for my colleagues, right, to ponder at what point does that make sense? Because, you would engage in that if we asked for it, right? So for colleagues to ponder, at what point does that make sense? I think it's an opportune time, especially with the strategic plan, just having gone through and using that to open a new proverbial spreadsheet and see what we come up with. I hope that makes sense.
Senior Vice President Franz or Vice President Tonneson, do you want to, either one of you or both of you want to tackle Regent Kenyanya's observation and question? Yes, Senior Vice President Franz.
Madam Chair, I'll start. I think what's interesting with Vice President Tonneson and myself She's been here for a number of years, and I've only been here for a few years, so we'll try to get our perspectives together here. But I think, from the position that I sit, I see that you're right, there are so many dramatic changes that we're confronting. I mean, just the challenges to the enrollment, the demographic challenges coming, and the challenges to make education more and more relevant, and at the same time maintain those standards that we think are really critical for academic research and and other scientific research to go forward. So I will say that from my point of view, we do need to step back, and I think part of what for me has been helpful has been the 2025 plan to be that sort of guiding post, because this, President Gable, when she decided to continue with that, when was that? In the early days of COVID, I think it was. And I was like, oh, really? Can we just put that off? She was right not to do that. I mean, we were all busy and really hard, but I'm so glad that we did that, because to me, looking at the 2025 plan, it provides a direction that I think we need to go, that I think we can help the university go to meet those challenges in terms of, fulfilling the mission, in terms of supporting teaching and research, and how do we do that in a really equitable way, opening up our doors to more and more people, and providing more affordability for more and more families in Minnesota. So from my perspective, the challenges that you talked about are there, and I think from my point of view, we've at least started that initial addressing them through the 2025 plan, but maybe Vice President Tonneson has some other ideas.
Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Mayron, Regent Kenyanya, I agree totally with Senior Vice President Franz said that the Impact 2025 provides that guide. But from a sort of budget geek perspective, when you get down to it, the budget forces decisions and forces you to look at things in new ways. And as I see it, if to do sort of a zero-based budgeting type of exercise to start from the bottom and build is a very time and resource intensive process, and not something we could do for every single unit, every year, certainly. But I will say this, I think that the reallocation process that we force units into, coupled with the guidance from Impact 2025, forces some of that work, because they have to think through, given the resources I have available and where I am supposed to go, how do I get there and how do I shape that? And particularly in units that are in financial challenge at the moment, that even forces it more. So for example, when I mentioned that we're going to be setting up teams for Crookston, Duluth, and Morris, some of that work will be really digging into where do we want to go, but what do we have to get there? And so how do we reshape the building blocks, if you will, to get where we want to go? So I think, it's a little bit of we do that, but not all the way down to zero every year with every unit. Hope that's helpful.
Madam Chair, briefly.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That was very helpful from both of you. And I agree. I mean, I certainly wouldn't ask for that on an annual basis. And to your point, it is, resource and time intensive. And maybe that incremental model does make sense. I think my point is that at some point, and then you go back to the incremental for maybe another 10, 20 years. And then, okay, look at how things have changed. But again, back to my point that and I know this is probably a better question for the president, but it does fall back on the board, right? And I think this is that opportune moment. So I'd ask colleagues to kind of think about that, where that makes sense as we go into, priority and agenda planning for next year. That may be something we'd think about requesting. Thank you for the responses. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Let me just say, I was asking Mr. Langworthy to see if he could find it, but my memory is within Impact 2025, there in the 5th section, there is a metric there that is going to require the administration to come forth, and I don't remember if it's by 2023 or the year, basically rethinking the way we view our finances, our budgeting process, tuition, all of that. In other words, to take a global look at how we do this in the future, and is there a better way to do this at the university, taking into account what's going on in higher education. So that, I think we built that into the plan. I was asking Jason if he could actually find the name of the metric that we used and the date by which The president's office will be coming forth with that, but what you're talking about, Regent Kenyanya, I think we baked into the plan. Obviously, it's not soon enough for any of us, as that is clear. At least on my now 3 years of addressing budget issues, we've been talking about this as well, but we have baked that into our strategic plan. And if I find it, I'll reference it back for everyone. All right, Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Mayor and Vice President Tonneson. As ever, thank you for walking us through something that's really complicated and really challenging in a very clear way. And this is a challenging year and a tough budget. I have three questions now that are sort of more kind of on the guts of the budget. The first one is, I know it's very hard to predict inflation. You showed a number of measures. And while there was, maybe a little bit of comfort yesterday and that at least the inflation number was down a bit. I mean, I think that the core inflation, was actually up, and which is the one that I think that we worry about the most. I see the risk here in this budget, or I don't think inflation's going to be lower than you thought. I'm worried that it'll be higher. And so my first question is, what do we do if it's higher, and what are the opportunities to lock in contractually, or really sort of manage at least to this year's number, regardless of what's going to happen to inflation going forward. So the first question is, what's the opportunity to somehow hedge and protect some of these cost numbers? Because I do worry that the risk is that it's going to be more than we thought. Second question is, in talking about compensation, does that include fringe? And would you comment on what's happening there? Because that is such a key part of compensation. I think it would be helpful for us to know what's going on there. And then the last question is, you mentioned the peak, that we're making a significant investment in implementing that program, which I think is good. I think it's a big opportunity. I think you said, we should at least, get that money back. I hope we get a whole lot more than getting that money back. And I don't know if you can talk to this, maybe Senior Vice President Horstman I think it would be really helpful to know what we're expecting, what kind of return we're expecting on that investment in peak, which is a very significant investment, but it's a very worthwhile project. So those are my three.
Okay, Regent Mayron, Regent Powell. On inflation, let's do that one first. The way I think about it, there's really 4 ways that we manage inflation within the budget. So let's see if this gets at what you're asking. The first would be, we have units that will predict and project cost increases on the front end. And for those that are large, that's built into this budget as an investment, right? So the utility costs are going up hugely at Duluth. We're planning for that. It's built into our plan and so on. So that's one way. A second way is through reallocation, which forces a reduction in spending. So if you look at the overall growth in expenditures, it's tempered by forcing units to make some cuts. But then the third cut piece that's built in here is, we expect each unit to live within their budget. Now, what that means during the year is, then they tend to be, over time, what I've noticed, not everybody, but generally speaking, they overestimate expenditures and underestimate revenues. So I'll come back to that. But in that process, they will decide as the year goes on, if things are costing more, I can't buy as many, or I have to change. Maybe, a course decides to do 1 field trip instead of 2, or they buy something different. An art class will buy a different type of supply. Whatever their choices are to live within the resources they have available. And so that's why when we typically look at the change in expenditures, the inflation, sometimes it kind of rears its head, but often not, because those decisions are made along the way. But then the fourth way it's handled, quite honestly, is for the unexpecteds. Now, I mentioned that units underestimate revenues and overestimate expenditures. That helps us in two ways. One, it tends to build a balance, which they then have available to handle kind of cost shocks during the year. And we ask them to handle that. So they don't come to us and say, I need $10,000 for this or that. We expect them to have the funds to pay for that. But it also, in that process, there's unanticipated savings for them, right? So if they're going through the year and they have turnover higher than they expected, and they don't hire for several months, they have a savings. That money then is available to cover those increased expenses, either them deciding, you know what, I want the second field trip, or handling expenses that they weren't anticipating. Same is true on the revenue side. If they end up generating more sales income, more royalty income, or whatever than they built into their budget, then that money's available. So it's a combination of managing it upfront, particularly for the large expenditure increases that we're projecting, and then just managing it as we go through the cycle every year. So that is, we believe it has worked in the past, and we'll have to see if the inflation continues and where it shows up. We also have the final piece, which is we have an open communication with each of our units that they know if they're running into some kind of financial issue that was unanticipated and they're having trouble managing, they let us know and we get involved and we help resolve that. So that would be my response to the inflation piece. I don't know if Senior Vice President Franz, you have anything addition to add to that?
Madam Chair, let me just add one point. I think
Certainly.
one of the things as we saw going through the capital plan that Vice President Berthelsen talked about, we have this ongoing program to enhance buildings, fix them up, get better heating and cooling. The annual save power on that is quite a bit. So I mean, the more we really improve our buildings in terms of energy use, I mean, that is kind of a double whammy. We're reducing the amount we use and we're getting the benefit of not paying that increased price. So that's not an insignificant amount on a university of size. And I just think it's something we sometimes overlook, an important thing that we keep that capital annual plan going because it saves us money in the long term.
Yep.
Any further
on that
follow-up?
piece?
Not on that one. It's very
Okay.
reassuring. Fingers crossed.
Well, yes, every budget, every year. On your fringe question, so fringe is going up 15% is our projection for next year. Now, remember that our fringe costs at the department level is done on a lagged basis. So for FY23, we're actually paying FY21 costs based on FY23 projected salaries, because it's a percent. So we know, for example, that the reason it's going up so much is because this year was so low. And this year was so low because the actual FY20 healthcare costs were so low. So it has honestly, it's got a multi-year impact. But that is when we talk about the total compensation cost increase is the 124 million, that is salary plus fringe. So we are building that in across all funds as part of our budget planning. Does that answer that question? On the peak savings, I'm going to defer to Senior Vice President Franz.
Senior Vice President Franz.
Thank you, Vice President Thompson. I think one of the things when we work with our partners now, Huron and within the university, is we try to examine, where those savings we can find in peak, because peak as an initiative is really designed toward that part of the university that, compensation makes up what percentage of our total?
About 62, 63%.
So your intuition is exactly right about that's where the money is. We believe that as we begin the implementation, we'll be coming to the board fairly soon in the near future to give you an update on the peak initiative. But one of the things we're pretty confident is that over the course, once we start implementing and get these positions changed and the reorganization done, that we'll be saving anywhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $20 million a year. That's on the low side. That's if we just do an okay job. To the extent we're able to excel at this, we think it can be more than that. So when you think about the opportunities to really enhance and become more effective and streamlined and provide those services to the teaching and research that we want to provide, I think there's a real opportunity here.
Thank you.
All right, Student Representative Mergendahl.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, Senior Vice President Franz, Vice President Thompson. You got me right in the middle of unwrapping a snack, so I'll have to hold on that for now. This one's a bit more of a comment than a question, unfortunately. I've got to say, I'm gonna be blunt. I've got some concerns here. I'll do my best to keep this brief, focused, and frank. So please forgive me if I stray from any of the courtesies of Minnesota nice. I was brought up on the Wisconsin side of the river, so. give me a break. I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room, and that is the tuition increase and how it will relate to the cost of living for students. And this is not an abstract number to be nudged around and adjusted for us. It is a direct and concrete addition to the financial burden that so many students are facing as the cost of living increases both around the state and in Minneapolis. To add insult to injury, this pay increase for student workers and often for staff as well is woefully inadequate. I ran the numbers out of curiosity. A Twin Cities undergraduate making about $12 an hour right now will see about an extra $250 a year coming into their paycheck. That is less than the $474 forecasted for an in-state tuition increase. Even considering that state and Pell Grant aid that you mentioned, it barely breaks even. Gas is up to $4 a gallon, even out on the prairie now. I'm glad to hear that that there have been some discussions of future pay increases for students in the works, but these promises are not putting food on the table now. It's also true that as system campuses are being let off a bit easier this year, although again, we are still not necessarily breaking even. What has me more concerned is on page 70, I think you can find it, second paragraph of the non-recurring items, the implication of future austerity measures for our campuses. I understand that there are areas where students are going to need to pay more in order to cover programs. I very much enjoy having the opportunity to participate in those decision-making processes as I've been able to do in Morris. What I'm more concerned with is this threat of potential spending reductions. I feel like I can say with a fair bit of confidence that in Morris, there is not much left that can be cut at this point. Almost every department that I'm familiar with is scrambling to fill vacancies with contract positions or is simply trying to do the same amount of work with fewer people. The results, as you might expect, are not ideal. I like some visual aids. I hope everyone else does. So forgive me, I brought one along. This was a chunk of the science building in Morris. I found it lying around when I was looking for a quiet place to study last weekend. I know this is more of an infrastructure capital issue. So sorry, Vice President Burleson, you're off the hook on this one. But I hope that this will drive home the fact that the system campuses and really all the campuses are not really in a position where we can afford a whole lot more austerity measures, especially if we're really focusing on providing this world-class education. And I'm almost done here. I also bring this up because of the fact that our budget, as VP Tonneson noted, does not exist in a vacuum. This discussion of a tuition increase comes as the state is, again, as mentioned, is considering the university's supplemental request, which ideally would help us get money to fix things like this. The state legislature, on the other hand, is understandably very concerned about our priorities. We are asking for hundreds of millions of dollars at the same time that we are about to put another burden on college students and their families in a time of continuing economic crisis. Whether the legislature actually intends to follow through on their intent to see more tuition aid in the coming years, we'll find out if the university asks them to, consider funding more tuition relief programs and waivers, such as our American Indian tuition waiver in Morris, which is, I believe, one of the unique expenditure obligations noted in the report. But at least to me, it seems that one of the last things that this board and administration should be considering doing is giving the legislature more excuses to turn us down when we ask them for necessary money now and in the future. I don't know much. I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert. I don't really know a whole lot. What I do know is that there are a lot of students around the state who are struggling to put food on the table, who are working multiple jobs, who are racing through a BA in only 2 years in order to avoid sinking deeper into debt. And I think there are elements in this budget that will address some of these symptoms, but this will only worsen some of the deeper issues that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Student Representative Mergendahl. Any comment by the administration? All right. Before I call on the next region, which is Region Farnsworth, I did want to tell you I did find, in reference to my comments to Region Kenyanya, under Commitment 5, Fiscal Stewardship Action Items, one of the action items is to develop a leading edge tuition and pricing model by 2023. So it's coming very soon, I hope. All right, with that, Region Farnsworth.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thank you, Vice President Tonneson, for this presentation today, which I thought was very detailed and easy to follow, and just a well put together presentation. So thank you for that. A few comments and a question or two. First, I want to think or kind of zero in on the system campuses, and there's been a lot of conversation today, particularly around some of the bridge funding that's going to be provided to the system campuses. One of the things I'm particularly interested in my board service is thinking about how we can really invest in a sustainable way in the crown jewels that are system campuses. A few comments on that. Kind of following along the conversation or the points that Regent Kenyanya brought up around making incremental changes versus thinking more holistically in how we do this from a budget model perspective. Thank you, Chair Mayron, for bringing up some of the points from the system-wide strategic plan that get at that. I think that was very helpful and good reminder for me. And I think, when taking UMD, for example, thinking about what the impact of just making incremental changes can be, for instance, when there's reoccurring cuts in services and in different areas, that can go on to create inefficiencies. And when we're thinking about peak, I think that's one thing to be aware of. The second point I would make is again along the lines of what Regent Kenyanya was saying. For a system campus like UMD, looking at a balanced budget as opposed to incremental change is an approach that I hope we move further towards. So one of the other points I'd make about the system campuses, and this was just touched on a little bit by our student representative, and thank you for your comments, by the way. The need for investment in tuition reductions to get us more into alignment with the institutions that surround our system campuses. I've said that before here, so that probably isn't going to be a surprise to many, but that's something I wanted to highlight that I hope a topic of conversation that I hope we have as a board moving forward, particularly in relation to that upcoming metric around tuition strategy in the MPAC 2025 strategic plan. The other thing I will add, reference to the system campuses. I was happy to hear about the proposal to withdraw earnings from the temporary investment pool to support the systems, but again, hoping to see that within a larger framework of sustainable investment versus the incremental cuts, which can create cycles of debt in the future. I'm glad Regent Powell had asked that question about peak, because that was something that was similarly on my mind as well, because the $10 million figure for peak implementation stood out to me. And then as we got a little bit into the presentation, the actual $15 million estimated for UMN and consultant implementation costs over 3 to 4 years seemed high to me. So I'm hoping we hear more about that in the near future, because the overall goals and objectives of peak, I think, are really important. But we have to make sure that that implementation costs don't seem to be out of scale. So I know that's coming towards us here in the near future, according to VP Fran's answer to Regent Powell's inquiry on that. I guess the last thing I'll say is around tuition, revisiting tuition, and then the room and board conversation, which I'm going to lose the exact slide number. On page 157, about student fees and room and board rates, we'll address a portion of related cost increases with the tuition increase, which is something, in general that I'm concerned about, but then also looking at room and board rate increases as well. And perhaps we'll get to some of this in the next presentation with Vice President Horstman around the annual workforce and human resources strategy reports. But I can only speak to some feedback that we heard from students on the Twin Cities campus in the lunch that I talked about earlier in mission fulfillment, where, particularly this semester, and of course this has been due to COVID and supply chain and other issues, but some of the retail dining operations in particular, which of course would be related to room and board rate increases, have been really struggling here on the Twin Cities campus this semester, and there's been a lot of things that have been closed due to workforce challenges, and that relates to a bigger student worker wage conversation, which I know students are interested in and the administration is working on. And so, if room and board rates are going to go up, we have to make sure that we're maintaining the level of services that are related to those costs for students. So a little bit meandering, so I apologize for that. This hasn't been my most concise statement around this horseshoe, but those are some of my concerns. Those are some of my thoughts, particularly around system campuses, tuition and student services. And I look forward to hearing thoughts from the community tomorrow, from the public forum, and then listening to the rest of colleagues' discussions, because it's hard to go in the middle here, because I have a lot of thoughts and ideas, but really appreciate hearing everyone's perspective as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Regent McMillan.
Thanks, Chair Mayron. Let me start with just picking up on the Kenyanya initiated theme of incrementalism, and then I've got a couple specific questions that I hope we can not answer now, but things that are going to weigh into my head as I think about this whole proposal. The budget model, that we have, and this is not a critique of it, it's just the reality. It dates back 2 presidents before President Gable, and it's approaching 14 years, I think, in existence. And it is a good model, Vice President Thomason, but it's built around some assumptions about tuition dependency, central funds, and I think what we do with the actual model is more about getting back into those original assumptions and determining what's a college. And I'm really focused on our regional colleges now, our regional campuses. What competitive landscape do they face? What is their mix of STEM and business versus liberal arts and humanities? I mean, where can they go to the market and find increases? We talked about Swenson and Duluth and Carlson here, and CSE's ability to add surcharges. I mean, that's reflective of their pricing ability and how they can, what the demand is for those things. So what was true in 08, 09, and probably has proven untrue since, isn't true anymore. And then we've got to look at the competitive landscape for a regional comprehensive school or a public liberal arts school, or what we face up in Crookston. And I'm worried about the Twin Cities too, but I seem to get a lot of data and a lot of understanding about the market in which the Twin Cities competes. And I worry a little bit less about its ability to compete in that market than I do about Duluth, Morris, and Crookston. So the budget model to me is when I talk about its incremental nature, we can't address those fundamental assumptions that have proven wrong in the last 13, 14, 15 years with an incremental approach. And I think the beauty of MPACT 2025 is that we're going to go back and look all that over. I also don't expect the president and the executive vice president here to tackle something without a whole new set of assumptions around which we can work. So when I critique the incremental nature of this, it's about the tools we have to address things that to me appear to be fundamentally changed in the course of a decade and a half, and they cry out for being addressed. So enough said, nobody needs to respond to that. I just appreciate it coming up, and it's a system-wide challenge, and we've got to get to the bottom of it. Questions that I'd love to not necessarily hear answers to today, but things that I'm looking for more answers as I weigh this overall budget proposal. On the cost management side, I do support the pay increase. I think that we've got to go there. People are our most critical, important resource, and we're probably under market with that kind of a number, and it's a huge cost driver. But I'll just go on record to say that I support what you're doing. I support your prioritization of our staff, our faculty. Without them, we can't get anything done. And I support it in the sense that I believe we are at I don't know that they're historic, but we're at very low head counts relative to where we've been in the past. Now, way past? No, not necessarily, but I'd like to see a little more data around head counts and where we've landed this year, because to me, that's key. If we're going to increase pay, we're going to have to manage head count, and I think we've done a good job of that, but I'd like to see more on that. And then to pick up on another theme, you got to take a lot of faith on what Peak is going to deliver, because we have to continue to get at that head count issue. And I really hope that as Peak goes forward, that it's finding, I'll just be blunt, there's 45 RCs here, 40 to 45, and there's 5 around the rest of the state, 5 or 6 or 7. And the money is spent here, and Peak got to get to the bottom of where we spend it here. So I'm looking for that. There's probably savings still to be had. I appreciate Student Representative Mergenthal's comments about what he sees at Morris. I, of course, live down the street from UMD, so I see a lot of that too, but the vast majority of the money is raised and spent here, and Peak has to get to the bottom of that. I think that is just critical. So more info on head count. I support the pay cost on that piece. I'm also needing some more competitiveness implication data before I can get behind the tuition proposed increases again at Duluth, Morris, and Crookston. And again, I'm not suggesting I'm fully behind the proposed increase on this campus, but I understand competitiveness implications here a whole lot better than I do at Crookston, Morris, and Duluth. And when I do the math in my own head, I'm going to use UMD. I get 8% for cost for housing and food. I get 2% for the tuition increase. I'm rounding. And then I got another 5 for student fees. That's 15%. Well, I may be doing the math wrong, but before I can get behind that, I've got to understand what does 15% mean, a la UND, NDSU, University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, La Crosse, they're direct competitors. And the same would be true for Morris and Crookston. And I don't need detailed analysis there, but what does that total cost of increase mean in their ability to compete? Because if we raise their tuition, their fees, their food, their housing costs, and enrollment goes down further, we've just created a bigger problem for ourselves. So probably enough from me, but those are some things that I'll be looking for as we go forward. I want to compliment you on the creativity of the TIP and CEF outcome. I want to thank UMF for some more resources there. And I say all that about system campuses, and I don't mean to drive by or ignore or be unthankful for the $7 million of bridge funding, because that is a big deal too. But these regional campuses are in distress, and I appreciate the fact that we're finding some temporary one-time funding for them to help us get to that new budget model of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. Regent Hipsch.
Thank you, Chair. And Vice President. So I guess what I'm going to talk about, I'm just kidding. But I kind of tend to agree with Regent McMillan on what his comments are. I feel for Student Representative Mergendahl and what his comments were and what's happening. And we kind of have the tale of two states here. We have the greater Minnesota campuses, and we have the Minneapolis campuses, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And they're different things, and marketing doesn't necessarily work the same everywhere. And I was just running some numbers, and NDSU has more Minnesota students at it than it has North Dakota students. And I think you could take UND, and you could take South Dakota State, and you could take Iowa's trying to pick up, and they're marketing the heck out of Minnesota, and good for them. That's what they have to do. They don't have the population in North Dakota, so they're winning on the marketing front, and we're taking it. And frankly, I don't think that we need to get our act together on the marketing thing in order to promote these great campuses in greater Minnesota. I really believe that that's the first thing we need to do. And then secondly, we know we have 600,000 plus alumni system-wide, and we know every dollar we spend at the Alumni Association, we get about $40 back, but they're way underfunded as far as the university goes. And so we're not engaging as much with our alumni as we should be. I mean, during the last campaign, $4.5 billion, $4.4 billion campaign, that generated 112,000 scholarships for University of Minnesota kids, 112,000. That's huge. And I think that And I agree with the incremental comments versus what's transformative. When do we start moving into transformative change on some of these outstate campuses? So I'm in general, whenever you can have a budget that's, where wage increases are half the inflation and tuition increases are a quarter of the cost of inflation, I'm generally for that. But I too want to wait and see. But I think we need to spend some money in some other areas and see how that takes us. So thank you.
Thank you. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. I have a couple of questions, and then would like to make a comment if that's okay. This is a very good conversation. I'm appreciating hearing some of these perspectives, and it, to some extent, when you think about the dynamic of increases for compensation and tuition in our differently located schools, it almost makes me think that this process should be starting a couple of months earlier, where we set benchmarks, because by the time we get to this level of development, it's very hard, I think, to affect movement. And then once you get past the exhaustion of June, we don't really think about it again until we're just about on this same precipice. And so I think if you can keep that same analysis going, I think that's a good thing. My first question is to Vice President Tonneson. When we're talking about these increases of 2.55% to 4.54%, does that include the surcharges?
Regent Mayron, Regent Rocha, no, it does not in those tables.
Thank you. And the reason that I raised that is that, that you add that on top of that, that's a really big increase for those students. And, as administrations come and go, we've gone back and forth as an institution from differentiating the cost based on the product to wanting to make sure cost doesn't prevent people from pursuing what their life's desire is based on their inability to afford science and engineering. Therefore, they must go to a less expensive institution. I favor the second. I favor keeping accessibility on a cost basis as low as possible as a public institution, and not forcing a student to say, well, I can't go to science and engineering or Carlson because I can't afford that additional bump. That's real money. It's significant money. And I find that challenging. My second question is, I just want to make sure I understand. So we're talking with the Peak Initiative, I saw this $10 million investment up front as reported today. Are we talking $20 million annual savings on a $4 billion budget? Is that across the entire budget, 20 million?
Senior Vice President Franz.
Yeah, Madam Chair. Yeah, the estimate that Vice President Tonneson talked about was $15 million. That's for all costs from consultants, the UMN, internal costs over 3 to 4 years of implementation. So that would be spread out over those 3 to 4 years. And we're looking at annual savings of $10 to $20 million per year.
Well, across the entire
year.
Out of $4 billion. Okay. I appreciate the answer. These are my thoughts. And I don't know that I will likely surprise anybody. And just speaking to the fact that I think that the tuition challenge is really significant. I mean, for one, when we in talking about our system campuses, we talk about we can add the surcharges in these high demand programs in the Twin Cities because the market will support it. But then when we have numbers problems on our system campuses, we don't say, well, the market says we can't be charging that much because we're not getting enough students. So we use the market force in the one context, but not in the other. I don't know that makes a lot of sense to me. It's like we should, you obviously look at the campus that is under enrolled and say, well, this is something that maybe we could recognize that we're not meeting mission by educating the industrious classes of our state because we're not bringing them in. But looking again at what our mission is and recognizing that this board is really the only opportunity with input from students that to protect that access. And when you look at how incredibly quickly tuition has grown across the country, it's really a challenge. It's a national dialogue right now, what to do with this student debt. And then I don't know if we kind of put blinders on and say, well, we're just going to continue to move forward this way because we're just making it worse by increasing this. But talking about this institution specifically, last year I posed the question about how I respond to a question about why we're so much higher than than our regional peers. If you look at the Midwest region, I was just pulling up the numbers from 21-22, Illinois and Michigan, we're within a couple thousand of Illinois and we're within 1,000 of Michigan. They're the kind of our two peers in that 15, 16, 17 range. But then after that, you get to Ohio State, which is at 11,518 for tuition. We get to Indiana, 11,221. Wisconsin is 10,742. Those are substantially lower. And I'm trying to understand, and I would request some feedback on how it is that Wisconsin, which, Wall Street Journal just came out and ranking their teaching schools, and they again bested us a bit, but I don't worry about those sorts of rankings, although others seem to focus on that. So you can't say Wisconsin isn't a quality competitor of ours, but they last year received was it 529 million dollars from their state legislature for Madison. Now, obviously, we've got other campuses as well, but I'm pretty sure our system campuses didn't get $200 million in this last cycle. So with less state funding, they're still able to deliver this product that is excellent, and with almost 50%, we'll say 40% lower tuition. And I think that's something that we really need to look at. I'm a little bit confused by the 15% increase in fringe. We already know that we're starting very high among if you break out our compensation pool. And I just want to make sure that we truly understand where that is. And I'm not trying to be critical of taking care of our staff and faculty. I think that's really, really essential. But I'm just trying to understand why these numbers do what they do as we are in this position where we're a bit higher than our peers. I did ask the question of the board office if I could get a list of over the last 5 years, how many positions have been created at the institution. And I believe who was speaking of the fact that we're actually down in overall numbers, which is interesting because over the last 5 years, the category that has grown, one of the categories that's grown is characterized as leadership, and that's gone up by 4%. And I think this board, as you all know, has substantially increased the compensation for certain top end folks. I mean, there's money there. It's not just an appearance issue. There's actually real money there. But when you have a 5% decline in employment overall, I don't know how that savings isn't sort of taken into account for the increase in compensation. I'm not sure where the savings is going necessarily to get us to that point. But the bottom line is, and this is really speaking very, very, very directly to trying to assist those students that, especially the ones that don't have Pell Grant and other opportunities for coverage, the ones that are having to self-fund. But when we talk about inflation right now, the families and students face that inflation every day. They have that same impact, but at a time in their lives or in their families' lives where they're trying to also cover the cost of higher education. And so, I think that we are out of alignment with the cost as a public university in this marketplace. I mean, obviously, there was at one point a dream of making it tuition free. That's a couple hundred years ago or 100 some years ago now, but I don't know that we're very close to that. But nonetheless, I think that where we are compared to other institutions, we are out of alignment. And from that standpoint, I don't see how, obviously, when you're 40% higher, any increase we make is 1.4 times that for the other schools in terms of our maintaining a competitive rate. And then on top of that, I just don't think we should make this the debt problem more difficult for a new range of students. So as we go forward, I'd like to understand, if I could, how it is that our peers to the east are able to, with less state funding, maintain a high quality product with a substantially lower tuition rate. If I could get an understanding of where that distinction is, I would sure appreciate it. And, in the absence of having something really clear, I can't see where it's good public policy for this board to raise tuition. And I think that's, I think I reflect the opinion of a lot of other state leaders and a lot of people across the state in saying that we need to work really hard to maintain and improve affordability for Minnesota students at the university. Thank you.
Thank you. Any response from either? Yes, Senior Vice President Franz.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thank you, Regent Rocha. I think one of the things that we've learned in comparing universities, and it's a difficult business, as you know, because it's hard to compare apples to apples sometimes. And I think one of the things that when we sort of pull back some of the some of the tuition elements. And let me first say that I realize that the so-called sticker price in the tuition rate is an important component of what you promote. But part of what we have found in cases with really low tuition rates and low state support is a higher fee, reliance on higher fees. So there's only so many ways you can fund a university. And so, I think that you have to look at the fee situation in some of those cases. I know in Wisconsin, for example, some of the fees are continue to rise quite a bit. So you don't want to disguise your tuition by hidden fees, right? So we really try to answer a lot of these issues through the idea of support, trying to help people afford it. And I think that's why we've really doubled down on the scholarship programs, on the Promise program, on the tuition-free program, on the American Indian program, to really make sure that those folks who need the help get it. And in fact, you mentioned it already, the fact that the legislature, if they would fully fund our tuition scholarship programs, both for the system and for the regional campuses, I think it would make a tremendous difference. Really provide some relief that would go a long way to solving a lot of enrollment issues in those other campuses. But that's sort of a high level take, and we can certainly get you more information. I don't know if Vice President Tonneson has anything else.
I would just add, Chair Mayron, Regent Rocha, yes, we can get you some more information on Wisconsin as we don't know everything. I'd like to say that, and to be able to answer that question completely, you have to have a really good understanding of their budget to go in and say, how can you do this? So I can't pretend that we would be able to answer it in full, but we do know, for example, and what things that I would look at would be what benefits do they get by being in a system? So for example, I happen to know their fringe costs are not paid by the campus, they're paid by the system. So when you say they don't get as much state money, that's in part because they don't have all the costs that we have either. So I would want to look into that. In addition to that, their resident, non-resident mix is significantly different than ours. They do attract a lot of students from Illinois, so I would want to look into that. I believe that's worth tens of millions of dollars compared to our non-resident population. So there's those pieces, the fees that Senior Vice President Franz mentioned. That's also something I would look into because I think while they're not raising tuition, they are raising fees more. And then the other thing is that they did more recently open the gates a little bit more than we did, and they did increase their enrollment significantly, their freshman enrollment. So those are just some of the components, but that also then make it difficult to just look at a number and compare because there are you have to kind of put it all together, I would say. The other thing that I would just like to respond to really quickly is your question about fringe. And I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that, for example, our healthcare costs are going up 15%. That is a question that Vice President Horstman and his team can respond to. What I'm talking about are what we charge our departments, the expense that the departments are going to have for the full suite of benefits. And that would be retirement, healthcare, tuition benefits, all those pieces, Medicare and Medicaid and all those things. And what's our 15% is the increase we're charging departments compared to this year. Right? And again, it's because our actual costs from 21 are higher than they were in 20, and it just is this lagged impact. But I just wanted to answer that really quickly because I don't want you to think that our healthcare costs are going up 15% and we're not controlling them. They're going up, but it isn't that. It's that actually will hit us 2 years later in the budget. What we actually have to pay in healthcare costs, we don't pay as an institution for 2 years because of the methodology we're required to follow for sponsored grants. So we could have a whole tutorial on that sometime if you're interested. It's confusing and a mess, and we're required to follow it. But in reality, the costs this year were significantly low. And as you might remember this, when I was here last year, we built into the FY22 budget a forced, if you will, pre-funding for some of this increase. So the $50 million increase in O&M and tuition that we're showing for fringe or for compensation would have been $75 million. We actually pre-funded $24.6 million of that this year in our budget, knowing that this would happen. So it is a complicated series of calculations, but it is a real cost increase for the departments.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
We're butting up against some time constraints here. We have another very important topic, but I do want to make sure those who have yet to speak have an opportunity. So we have Student Representative Kurtz up, then Regent Sviggum, and then Regent Verhalen, and that's all we're going to have time for today. I want to make sure everyone gets at least one round of comments. And go ahead, Student Representative Kurtz.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I've never actually spoken in person here, so I think I've asked a question once on Zoom, so this is exciting. But I appreciate that you're making the time for me. So I have a comment and then it'll lead into a question. But I introduced myself formally to a few of you, but just to let the whole room know, I am a graduate student, and like 5,000-ish other graduate students, I'm a graduate worker too. I feel like that sometimes gets lost. I am a worker as well as being a student. And, you know, I think that folks like me are pretty important to how this university runs as well. I grade exams. I have a stack of about 60 in my bag right now. I grade essays, I grade assignments, I run labs, I answer anxious undergrad emails at 1 a.m. I talk with students who are crying in my office hours. I feel like we all do pretty important work here. I've been here for 5 years and things have only really gotten worse in those 5 years for graduate students like me. Being able to afford basic necessities, rent, all the fees that get thrown at us as well. Lots of things are pretty expensive and they're only getting more expensive. And, you know, seeing that 3.85% pool and comparing it to 8% cost of living inflation is kind of troubling to me. So I just want to kind of make a note that, the 3.85, I think Cal mentioned this as well, not really cutting it from a graduate student perspective. That said, I do appreciate an effective pay cut of 4%. As opposed to an effective pay cut of 8%. So thanks on that front. So that's my comment. It leads into my question of, this is a merit pool increase, and that's a little bit confusing to me. I think that this is similar to the 1.5% increase from last year, which grad students were in that pool. However, this was not uniformly given to all grad students. There were grad students who got that 1.5% raise and grad students who didn't. Like I said, we're looking at 8% increases on everything being more expensive. This 3.85% will help, but I just want to know more about how that will play out for grad students. Are we all going to be guaranteed a 3.85%? And if not, how does it work out? So that's my question. And then thank you for listening to my story.
Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Mayron, Student Representative Kurtz. Actually, there's other people in the audience that would probably be better able to answer this than I would, but I will offer this, which is it isn't guaranteed, so it's not an across the board plan. It would be a merit plan, which means there's discretion at the unit level for how to distribute those funds.
Okay, thank you. I will take that to COGS. We will be concerned about that this year as we were last year.
And if I misspoke, Vice President Horstman, you can correct me when you are up here.
Thank you. Regent Sviggum.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. VP Tennyson, this budget of President Gable's became public probably last Friday when we had the docket come forward. So in a week, how many groups or persons have contacted you thanking you for the budget as it turned out for them?
Chair Mayron, Regent Sviggum, zero, no one.
No one. So no one has really come forward and said, we love this budget.
No.
Which to me tells me that is probably a pretty good balance. We used to say that if nobody was totally happy with an agreement, the agreement was probably pretty good. It was probably pretty balanced. Julie, I want to thank you for, from my perspective anyway, for listening and acting on groups that you've listened to. And on the bottom line, reconciling a budget. We can all have various requests or needs or wants, but the bottom line is you got to reconcile it. We have to reconcile. And I think you've done a very good job at doing that. Our employees, our staff, do they deserve more than 3.85%? Probably do. What's inflation, 8.5, maybe even higher than that? And I'd like to give them more. I think you would too. And we might need to give them more to keep people here, to keep the good folks here in a competitive market that exists out there. But you've listened. From a tuition standpoint, 3.5%, you probably don't want to do a 3.5% tuition. On the other hand, if inflation's 8.5, and on the other hand, if in a historical perspective, I think we did 0% 2 years ago and 1.5% last year. Folks, had the University of Minnesota done what Minnesota State did those 2 years, 3.5% each year, we'd have probably had about another $85 million of revenue that we could use in this budget if my figuring is right. About 35 million 2 years ago, that base plus another 2% last year comes to about 50. That's about $85 million. I think I'm within the ballpark. Close enough for government work, let's say. Anyway.
Close enough for government work. And I'm in the government.
That's significant, but you've listened to students and you've listened to the bridge that is necessary, the funding for Regent McMillan for UMD, the bridge funding for Crookston, for Alton Morris, a student representative. You've listened to them, and there's some bridge funding here. So I want to compliment you. I think you've listened to people, you've reconciled a very difficult situation to reconcile, and put in a perspective of everybody's issues and everybody's concerns and everybody's needs. You've done a pretty damn good job of balancing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Verheugen.
I'm going to keep it really short, Chair Mayor.
Okay,
So,
good.
and I'm going to ask a question and make a request off something that Vice President Tonneson mentioned, which was non-resident tuition. And my limited understanding, I've been here 12 months and I'm still learning, when looking at our resident and non-resident, let's say we compare to the Big Ten, we fall midpoint up on resident tuition, but we fall way low on numbers for non-resident tuition. Regent Rocha mentioned University of Michigan. They're about 15,000 with our Twin Cities campus. Their non-resident is 50,000, 50,000, which is a huge difference in that to make up a lot of funding for resident students and additional funding elsewhere. And so as we go forward, I would appreciate more information on what conversations go into establishing our non-resident rate and whether we are keeping a pace of where that should be within the Big Ten with our peer institutions. So that's comment and question, and now I'm done.
All right. With that, we are going to take a 5-minute break and then immediately move on to the next agenda item, which is the annual workforce and human resources strategy report. 5-minute break.
you know, before she made the comments, yeah, everybody sends it. Merit. I know you.
I call the Finance and Operations Committee back to order. Our next item is the new annual Workforce and Human Resources Strategy Report. This new report is the result of the board's recent work to streamline required reporting and merges the report on workforce and total compensation and the university health benefits report. Here to present the report is Vice President Horstman. Vice President Horstman, welcome and please proceed. Let me apologize up front for cutting your time down on what is obviously a very important item for us. Luckily, we had oodles of materials from you that we had an opportunity to review in advance of today's meeting, but let's go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Regents, SVP Franz. Thank you for the opportunity to present on the annual workforce and total compensation reports. This year, the presentation will focus on what we are doing to address some present opportunities. This work is evolving and will reside in what we plan as a system-wide HR strategic plan that aligns with PEAK and supports the commitments of MPACT 2025. In today's presentation, I will cover various aspects of our compensation, our medical plan, and talent to convey to you examples of current work underway through our office that is engaging the university community. This does not encompass all work in the discussed areas, but it does provide examples of impactful and relevant efforts that address current opportunities and the challenges that these opportunities present. We will conclude with an update on the future of work at the university and how we are moving forward coming out of the pandemic. MPACT 25 guides the work of human resources at the university. Commitment 4, community and belonging, speaks directly to the acquisition and retention of talent in an equitable and inclusive way. Commitment 5 on fiscal stewardship speaks to supporting the employment of students on campus and also speaks to the fiduciary responsibility that human resources must own to navigate progress towards these goals in a fiscally responsible manner. This year, the Office of Human Resources, through its planning process, will build a set of goals and actions across human resource centers of expertise and practice, which will include the perspective of the Central Office of Human Resources as well as campus and unit HR leaders. Our goal will be to have a complete draft which will serve as a living document by this fall. The initial strategic commitments that will guide the strategic plan are these 4 commitments on this slide and are based on the foundational strategies of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and openness and expectation that we have to embrace change and that we manage it planfully and thoughtfully. To guide this discussion on compensation, I will walk through several examples of work across our total rewards and in our talent area, starting with our current state, what our strategy is, and use current action plans as examples of how we are moving the strategy forward. The current state of compensation at the university illustrates that the university's cumulative merit pool for the past 6 years does lag the National Education Organization average by a cumulative 3.7%, which is the relevant market for senior leadership and faculty. Our cumulative merit pool is more significantly behind that provided by all industries in the Minneapolis-St. Paul Metro, which is the competitive market for staff positions. Ensuring our own merit increase fund is competitive with merit pools of other employers is critical if we want our salaries to remain competitive. However, as important is the how of how we steward our approved salary pool to annually address critical areas. Typically, these merit increase amounts also do keep pace or exceed inflation. This year is an obvious exception to that. However, for 10 years between fiscal year 10 and fiscal year 20, our cumulative merit increase outpaced inflation for those same years by 8.35%. In years with high inflation, organizations do struggle if they try to chase inflation. Often then benchmarks are compared to one another to provide a merit increase that is competitive relative to other organizations, but obviously is not equal to the rate of inflation. The current rate of unemployment is 2.5%, and this low unemployment is consistent with the current challenges we see in some hiring. The positions to market described for senior leadership, faculty, and staff are composites, and from the reports you have, you can see a great deal of variance between leadership positions, faculty on different campuses, and job families. Looking forward, the practice of compensation at the university must continue to evolve to understand the market in order to best steward our resources. While information provided has grown and improved over recent years, we still have work to do. This includes the completion of a refinement project. It also includes a review and recommended change to an expanded peer group to better define the market for senior leadership positions and faculty. We must use our annual salary increase pools for merit-based increases, and we must find a way also to adjust for equity and for market, addressing critical market-sensitive positions. In a moment, we'll look at specific current actions underway. First, I would like to share a timeline of current and future work over the next 3 years. I want to highlight a couple of important projects on this timeline. Currently, we are addressing the need for a more detailed and specific benchmark data in partnership with UEA at Duluth. The result of this project will be the ability to benchmark faculty salaries by discipline rather than the single broad faculty benchmark you see in the report today. We expect this project to inform similar work, if successful, for our non-union faculty positions in the future. We have also introduced the idea of market adjustment accounts, which for the current year would be held in the RRC unit budgets. We have advised 0.25% off of the current merit pool number for this type of account. That would then be used to address other situations in the market beyond merit pay. The work on this timeline is significant internal work completed with only internal resources to this point and no external contracting. It does not represent the sum total of the work of our compensation team. The current work with UEA faculty benchmarking involves defining the market for Duluth faculty and then completing a market analysis for each discipline. We hope to complete this work in FY23, and if successful, we'll apply the same approach to other campuses. This visual shows how we will move away from comparing Duluth faculty salaries to market-based on one general average without regard to discipline being taught at Duluth or any of the other schools. Instead, we will now be able to report and analyze how each discipline and faculty member is paid relative to market. We're also adopting a more accurate market for future Duluth analysis as defined through Carnegie classifications. These improvements will allow UMD to strategically invest in positions that are the most behind the market and most critical to maintain. On another front, market adjustment accounts used for strategic priorities can, over a period of years, address the gap to market. The current slide reflects an example of how a market adjustment account could work. A campus or unit can create a subset out of this year's salary pool and set aside dollars to address critical needs. In this example, a unit has done just that. By setting aside 0.25% of the total salary pool, in a review of market data, they concluded that 2 positions are particularly critical and in danger of retention challenges. With 100,000 reserved from this 0.25%, they are able to address adjustments to 15 employees across these 2 positions. Decisions on how much each of the 15 employees may receive is determined by internal equity, performance, and mastery of work. If this process is repeated year over year, the unit will be able to address the equity and retention challenges according to priority and make progress on bringing employees more in alignment with the market rate. In order to ensure accurate reporting of senior leadership and faculty salaries relative to market, we are recommending a more expansive definition of the labor market for these employee groups. Historically, the university has used a small set of peer institutions for various benchmarking purposes, including compensation. Our appropriate labor market, however, should include the full set of organizations from which we draw leadership and faculty into which we lose them. For Morris, senior leaders and faculty, that certainly involves more than a set of 15 organizations. We recommend that we begin using Carnegie as our comparison market for future compensation analysis. Our compensation comparisons will be more valid when compared to the full market and will also be more reliable as the sample size becomes larger. Currently, salary trends can be greatly affected if even one or two peer institutions fail to submit data in a given year. The small number of our peer institutions will also make it impossible to find enough salary comparisons for specific faculty disciplines such as botany, plant biology, or perhaps even a senior leader search for a college. For UMD, we are recommending that they set their market at a combination of the M1 and R2 Carnegie classification. M1 universities are colleges and universities that award at least 50 master degrees per year. R2 universities must award 20 research scholarships for doctoral degrees and have a certain level of expenditure for research. Duluth's Carnegie classification has been in between these two categories, and often we have found that senior leaders and faculties come from schools in these two classifications and depart to the similar classified schools as well. In the end, expanding the number of organizations would allow us a comparative pool of peers of 458 institutions. It is important to note that the number of organizations in each Carnegie grouping is not necessarily the number that will provide salary data to various surveys. However, the increase in the number will ensure a consistent and accurate data set year over year. As we move into the medical plan, we will similarly go through several examples of actions we are taking to manage this plan appropriately. Our current state of our medical plan is that it offers a variety of options, providing coordinated support and care for employee independence with over 39,000 members on the plan. These networks can be affordable care organizations, broad national networks, as well as healthcare systems. As noted in past reports and presentation, our combined benefit level and out-of-pocket costs provide about the same value as that as higher ed peer institutions and provide a higher value than that found in the private sector. We want to continue to position our medical plan as a differentiator and at the same time offer more targeted solutions to support members and decrease prevalence of related medical conditions. This can involve a different approach to well-being and future changes to plan design and network. And I should note that plan design changes are collectively bargained for the medical plan-based plan design. I will speak to a sample of the initiatives presented on this timeline. We are currently developing a redesign of our well-being program so it can be accessed by all employees, not just those in the medical plan, and would expand the programming being offered by internal university experts. Much of this work will be realized in FY24 and 25, and there remains much consultation to complete this work, but potentially this work will save about 10% of the current costs that supports the well-being program and provide a much more impactful program. In FY22 and 23, we are conducting 2 market bids or RFPs. Currently, we are in the process on an RFP for our new employee assistant program vendor with expanded behavioral health services that includes immediate mental health access for children's teens and adults, as well as modernized care modalities. We have recently completed an RFP process on our pharmacy benefits management and specialty formulary support. Our current drug spend on our medical plan is approximately $54 million annually. Changing our bidding cycle now from 5 to 3 years will allow the university to more quickly adjust to market changes that can realize more savings to the university and plan members. While we will provide specifics on this new contract in the consent doc at the June meeting, I can say that we estimate that savings over a 3-year period potentially will be over $50 million. And that takes into account the inflation rate on the pharmacy plan. The current bidding process will yield not only an offset to the double-digit pharmacy trend, but we also have a provision in the agreement that will allow for an annual market check that can adjust our savings as we work through the contract. Our talent strategy is currently a work in progress with the goal of supporting commitment for goals under MPACT 25 by recruiting and retaining diverse talent and cultivating a welcoming and inclusive campus climate for faculty, staff, and student workers. We have defined 4 components that support talent as described on this slide. The capabilities of supervision and leadership directly impact the work environment and can create an environment for faculty, staff, and student workers that should be effective, supportive, innovative, trusting, and safe. Talent and performance management should provide a visible mechanism for an employer to provide direct and clear feedback to faculty, staff, and student workers and point to a career that includes value to both the university and the individual. Through identifying a projected career path that is both necessary for the future for the university and of interest to the employee, professional development goals can be set to realize an individual's potential. Performance management can set expectations, not only for individual performance standard metrics, but can set those expectations with leaders for improvement in our environment and equity, inclusivity, and engagement. Talent acquisition is a critical area of opportunity that requires attention and support in regard to tools and resources, both through current initiatives and improvements under PEAK. What is currently fragmented and transactional can be transformed into a modern, compliant, approachable platform and program for both internal faculty and staff, as well as prospective candidates that are external. Our engagement survey continues to build on record participation. What can be improved is follow-up action on the results. Many metrics in the survey remain favorable, yet there are opportunities from the present survey that, if acted upon, can bring improvement. Now, some quick facts on each of the current states. Approximately 1/4 of our faculty and staff across the university system supervise. This includes people in many roles, but they all play a pivotal role in hiring, engaging, and retaining faculty and staff. We have a number of supervisory and leadership development programs to support the development of skills of these supervisors, which they need to be successful. We have had increasing adoption of the university's performance management program that emphasizes regular periodic discussions between supervisors and employees. Currently, 69% of staff system-wide use this platform, which emphasizes leading practices and setting effective goals, ongoing feedback and coaching conversations throughout the year, and a final performance evaluation. Surveys show us that about 60% of employees feel these practices are done effectively, and data from our 2021 engagement survey showed meaningful increases in employees reporting that they receive regular and clear feedback on how well they're doing their work and that they receive development coaching from their supervisors. Opportunities for the future include working with the remaining 1/3 of the university to understand how we can include them in their efforts. Currently, there are over 300 individuals system-wide who are primary hiring authorities for their campus or unit at the university in the talent acquisition space. A common platform that ensures consistency in the hiring process based on core competencies that identify prospective candidates and match them to the position based on their projected success in the role currently does not exist. Recently, OHR has started to build a team that can support a consistent approach that acquisition system-wide and still allow a hiring authority to remain at the campuses and units where it belongs. Current metrics from our engagement survey reflect a strong 75% response rate, 73% favorability on key metric of commitment and dedication, and a 69% favorability on a key metric of having an effective environment. These results show us faculty and staff overall that are engaged and proving to be quite resilient in the face of many challenges that have come our way over the past couple of years. Opportunities include supporting units in colleges and taking action on results, as I have said before, and we will continue that conversation when we meet in June. The timeline for talent reflects a number of actions under our 4 strategic areas. Specifically, I'm going to talk about supervisor orientation, talent and performance management work, and improvements specifically in talent acquisition. The new supervisor orientation program provides supervisor strategies that for supervisory practices with context specific to universities' policy, procedures, governance, and priorities. Development resources continue from orientation to develop supervisor skills as they prepare to manage performance through facilitation to improve performance, to resolve conflict, to develop careers. And we also share with them the principles that a supervisor must carry and use sometimes in very difficult and complex discussions. Training is provided in many ways, including online, on demand, live events, self-paced, or instructor-led. This training has been developed in collaboration with the Disability Resource Center, OED, conflict resolution, and our EAP vendor. And the first cohort recently completed its session in early May, and we're looking forward to expanding this training in the future. We also are in collaboration and close partnership with the Provost Office of Faculty Affairs, having launched a college lead program that identifies faculty who have an interest and demonstrate potential to move into future leadership roles within their college or in their field. In department leadership programs, chairs learn how to assess their department, build a positive culture, and lead through collaboration toward an environment that is innovative, inclusive, and focused on excellence. Performance management, or TPM, sets a group of practice and tools that support strong job performance as well as employee growth and development. This involves developing practices around talent planning and internal mobility for staff, and helps colleges and units better assess and understand the skills and abilities of their workforce so employees can be more effectively aligned and developed, and succession planning can occur. As we move into talent acquisition, we are taking a number of steps to reach a broader and more diverse pool of candidates, minimize bias in the interviewing and selection processes, and improve candidate experience and quality of hires. And finally, assure a positive and engaging onboarding experience for new employees. This can involve what we call full life cycle recruitment, also called end-to-end recruiting, which includes workforce planning, sourcing candidates in advance, screening, interviewing and selection, hiring and onboarding. This approach improves the candidate experience, decreases time to hire, and increases quality of hires. With that, and given the time, I will spend a few minutes speaking about the future of work at the university. As you know, in July of 21, Work with Flexibility was introduced as a guide to how campuses and departments can manage work that involves a hybrid experience. Meaning some faculty, staff, and student workers may be working off-site, some may be on-site, some may be in other areas of the system away from their home office. In truth, the university has always had some hybrid work in its environment as we work across Minnesota. We have a national presence which requires travel, And our mission is, of course, international as well. The pandemic has pushed remote work to the forefront in national conversation among employers, and higher ed is no different. However, a dimension that also must be considered equally is time. The when of our work is compared to the where. How we navigate a hybrid environment as an opportunity in the future, and at the same time address the challenges it offers, will determine to a great extent our ability to retain our faculty and staff and allow student workers an experience that supports their education and their immediate needs. There is a need to be a flexible employer as well as a need to have a presence on campus. We must find the right balance for Minnesota, and it is possible that it will look different by campus or unit. The university community has been exceptionally agile and resilient over the last 2 years. There has been an answer to a call to action that has to be recognized, especially for those who day after day, shift after shift, came to campus to work on site because there was no alternative otherwise, and often no option to step away for even a moment. We also have had many who have worked off-site remotely, often not in circumstances that support work, but nevertheless, our faculty, staff, and students made it work, covering their own job and perhaps filling in as an interim in another role at the same time. As we go forward, we will learn more about how this environment works and can support those who work on site, hybrid or remote. Equity, fairness, and inclusion will be primary considerations for how leadership addresses campus or unit work. One aspect of place-based work that is a topic of conversations regularly in our Big Ten HR meetings, as well as nationally, is U.S. employment outside of a university's home state. Higher ed typically does have out-of-state employment, and Minnesota is no different. Much of our out-of-state employment has been neighboring states, primarily North Dakota and Wisconsin, where our employees reside, and given proximity to our campuses, they work on our campuses. However, we have historically had to travel and work to other states as well. The last 2 years has given us an opportunity to review this and improve our structure and manage this in a proactive way. To date, we have accomplished a great deal in regard to state tax registration, but this is only one component. We are aware and realize that we must follow state employment laws, which can be unique in each and every state, not just in regard to taxes, but also on employment matters such as leave and overtime pay and sales tax. And there are also unique state laws regarding foreign national taxation. To support a plan that takes all the factors into account, HR is working closely with our other university and partners to continue to address this matter. Having the capacity for compliance in this area is not a commitment to expanding out-of-state work, only to manage it properly when it is necessary. Going forward, the guidance for hybrid work will be a component of the hybrid workplace and space utilization initiative. This is led by AVP Leslie Kruger and Vice VP Mike Bertelson, and has a supportive executive council from all campuses, academic and administrative leadership, as well as HR, IT, and finance. Updates to guidance and reporting on work arrangements will be developed and communicated to track our work time and place to inform future space decisions, and will align with the needs of the state's only land grant higher education institution. And with that, I will stop and invite any questions you have. I have listed 3 to start the conversation, but you can choose one of those or one of your own. Thank you.
Let me ask one question as I wait for see who would like to weigh in, and that is, and reacting to your first question, reaction to the use of the Carnegie classification to set market for senior leadership and faculty. On the previous discussion we had, we talked about particularly for our regional campuses, who are they competing against? to draw students in. And I'm curious as we rattle off what we think are those campuses that compete with, say, Duluth or Crookston or Morris, are those the same campuses that will be captured under the Carnegie classification as we talk about competitive market for senior leadership and faculty? How do they relate, if at all?
They could very well be in those categories and classifications. A number of the schools mentioned, but this is a much broader national grouping of all higher ed institutions. And frankly, when we are hiring leaders, we are looking nationally. If you look at recent searches or searches over the past few years, when we get the finalists, often they are from another part of the country. And so we feel when we're looking at compensation matters, it is really important to have an inventory of the schools that recruit people from us and we recruit from.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Regent Farnsworth.
Thank you, Chair Mayron, and thank you, VP Horstman, for this presentation. I found it very, very informative. To directly answer to address two of your questions here on the slide. The first, reaction to the use of Carnegie classification to set market for senior leadership and faculty. I'm really glad to see us having this conversation around market definition for senior leadership in particular. And, I need to spend some more time with these docket materials, particularly I think the supplemental materials and the actual report on the bottom. So I just want to say that for my own accountability piece, because I'm really interested in this market data conversation in particular, but especially with the senior leadership piece, that's something that I've struggled with since being a part of this board, is how we utilize that in conversations, particularly around senior leadership compensation and scoping. So I want to get more familiar with the Carnegie classification. And another question I'd had was around some of the system campuses. So Regent Mayron seems to be on the same page and answer or kind of ask something similar to what I was going to ask. So that's helpful to hear that. But I guess that's my comment on the Carnegie classification part, is I hope that gets us to a better spot when we have future conversations around compensation for senior leadership. But saying, I guess, preliminarily, and for my own accountability, needing to do a little bit more work and research or engagement with the materials that you provided us, I'm feeling more hopeful, is I guess what I'll say to the first question. The questions around work with flexibility and the thoughts on the balance of place-based employment with the opportunity presented. That went off my screen. But the third question is, something that we heard the newer regents who were elected when we did a tour of some of the system campuses, and I checked my notes when we were going into this meeting, and I think on all the system campuses, I took a note of questions and concerns and want of further engagement around our work with flexibility guidelines. And of course, that was a little while ago, and now we're here looking towards the future. So that the information that you presented today was really helpful in kind of seeing what our vision is there. But really just want to make sure that we have deep levels of engagement from faculty, from staff, from others with determining what the future is of work with flexibility. Just this question that institutions like ours, every organization is dealing with. So those would be my two reflections. Thanks, Chair Mayron.
Regent Powell.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair Mayron. Thank you, SVP Horstman, for packing a lot into a very concise presentation. Thank you for the promotion. Yes. So I guess the first question I have is, the work you're doing, on the employer proposition, I think it's really good. It would match up, I think, with best organizations, in the state and around the country. Question I have is I think it would help me anyway to have an understanding of how we sort of value that work in terms of the total employee proposition, what metrics we would want to use to measure it. I mean, because the reason we're doing these things, I think, and I'll give some examples which may be right or wrong. We're doing them because we want external recognition as an employer of choice. You know, maybe that's why we're doing it, maybe not, but that would be something I would guess. We're doing it because we think if we do these things, it'll support really effective recruiting on our part because people want to work for us. We think it'll promote very strong retention, which is good for us. We're doing it perhaps because it helps with internal development of internal succession, you know, kind of building talent from within. And as I think about sort of the steps we're taking, it would help me to understand, you know, better what we want to accomplish with that, what the metrics are, what it leads to in terms of the health of the overall organization. I don't know if that makes sense, but we're doing all the right things, but it's kind of, you know, what's the end goal that we're hoping to get from it? I think these might be some of them. And but it would help to, I think, have a better feel for that.
Yeah. Chair Mayeron, Regent Powell, that's an excellent question. And I think we're at a point in time where we have an intersection of a number of initiatives here. A number of the activities and initiatives I described today and are in our reports are setting up a situation where the recruitment and hiring of individuals has a University of Minnesota presence as opposed to a presence of a specific unit. So there's a brand there. And the candidate experience, whether you get hired at Morris or the medical school, is at the same high level. And when they come in the door, the onboarding is complete and consistent, and they have it when they need it. And right now it's very decentralized. And so there is an experience that I think is baked into retention and the experience people have to where they feel comfortable performing at a high level as a faculty or staff member here. And that parallels the initiative of PEAK, because what PEAK will do to help with that is more clearly define administrative roles. And while our mission is faculty, we have very important administrative roles here as individual contributors, as well as all the way up to leadership. And right now, it is difficult to recruit someone and show them a career path at the university because it is also mixed and convoluted. We have very diligent, very caring administrators doing multiple types of work. And I think as we put all this together, there will be a vision there of what the work experience is and what that means as we go out and measure ourselves against others and market ourselves.
Bit of follow-up, Chair?
Sure.
Thank you. Appreciate that answer. And I you know, lots going on, but what I heard you say is there's an opportunity to consolidate this into really an employer of choice kind of brand, which I think is a great answer. Appreciate the direction. Two other quick ones. Really appreciate the sort of, if you will, the price discovery work that you're doing in healthcare, particularly, you know, on the pharma side. And I'm sure that there's a lot of value that can be found there without compromising, you know, the strength, the benefit, and very, very happy to hear that you're doing that. Very supportive. Last one maybe would be a similar thought in the pension area. I know that we connect with the state in certain very important areas to find benefit plans that are absolutely Cadillac, really, really good. As you and I were discussing beforehand, though, for many younger employees or part-time employers, they may not value that. And so this idea of offering maybe more of a menu in that area, and particularly 401ks, which have that great value of being totally portable for people who may have a shorter term time horizon. Just wonder if there are ways on the pension side to do the same, look for the same sort of optionality for employees with different needs, which, you know, may in a way be a win for them, but also a win for us in terms of the cost base.
Chair Mayeron, Regent Powell, you know, as we discussed, that is a interesting idea that we probably haven't specifically dug into. We are looking though at our benefits differently as we go forward, because to your point, what we offer today is a pretty traditional menu of benefits to a certain employee population that is eligible. And the demographics for the workforce are changing significantly, and many new hires coming in have a different view of what they value. We have many that look at the faculty retirement plan and say, why doesn't it help pay for my student loan? Others do. You know, so that's one shift that is bringing things into the retirement space. What I would say broadly is we have a quarter of our workforce that are part-time, and many of them are below the level where they're eligible for benefits. And like many employers, we do not offer benefits at a certain level. I do think it's a lot of work, but there is a need to look at a slate of benefits that can support that population long-term, because that is going to be the future look of our workforce going forward. And they're going to work for multiple employers, and they are going to want benefits that are portable, that they don't give up and repeat every time they take a new line of work. And that has been a very common discussion among employers in Minnesota in the past recent years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Rosha.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. When we go through, I haven't had a chance to kind of dig into the numbers a lot. We've had a lot going on, and as we go into this budget process, among other things. But I would very much like to maybe over the course of the coming weeks, maybe even sit down and really understand. And do we say Coupa or is it CUPA? How do we refer to the
Coupa?
Coupa. So the reason I would just simply say this, and this comes off of our budget discussion just recently, is I'm trying to make sure I understand which apples we're talking about, which apples we're comparing to. Because if you're talking about higher ed institutions across the country, a lot of our aspirational peers are in some pretty expensive markets. Throw somebody in San Francisco or Manhattan, and it's a very, very different marketplace than here. So I would very much like to understand a little bit more about that. But I also have a bit of a hesitance to get into the numbers this way, because it has this magnifying effect. It's the classic, we want to be above average, or in this case, we're saying 50%. We want to be above average. Well, as soon as you've attained above average, what have you done to the average? And especially if you're coming from where we are in a more moderate cost of living environment, when we pull ourselves up to that level against these other institutions, you can find yourself moving up. And it seems that this process of comparing yourself to peers as a justification for the continued growth and rates of compensation, especially in administration, over the last 30 years is when you saw for 120 years, the line kind of just moving along for the cost of higher ed and some of these compensation rates. And then all of a sudden, mid-90s, when the student loan money became available, everything just shot through the roof. And we're really expensive now by comparison to what it used to be. And so I'm very interested in being able to get a better understanding of the numbers that we are looking at, but also being somewhat hesitant to make that the sole consideration for whether we're doing a good job. Because I look at the goal, and I think you've spoken to this, and a previous question got to this, is attracting and retaining world-class folks and doing a great job is ultimately the goal. And that doesn't matter if you have to be at 75 or 25. If that's your goal and that's what you're doing the right thing. Because it kind of goes back to the tuition issue. I'm not, if we're just going by where we rank, we're kind of struggling, at least with our marketplace in our region for where we're ranking. But more than that, my goal is the lowest cost access to a world-class education. That's the goal. And then how do you get there? So I would just simply say that I'm really interested in having that conversation, understanding a little bit better on how we get to those numbers. I also see, this is just empirical observation, not a great deal of science or data behind it, but it seems like these processes fare pretty well for some categories of employees, but our sort of basic line workers, people in the I guess would maybe be less of a Coupa analysis and more of a local marketplace analysis. There's not a big gap there. There hasn't been the kind of growth that we've seen in other sorts of compensation. And I think that even goes into some of the faculty ranks. So if I would be able to, perhaps set up an appointment and come in and have that conversation, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Vice President Horstman, for a very comprehensive report and answering the questions. Lots here and lots for us to get our arms around as we move forward. So I appreciate all the work that you did. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chair Maron.
All right, at this point, we will move to the consent report. And so first, Senior Vice President Franz, would you summarize the items in today's consent report?
Thank you, Chair Mayron. I'd be happy to. We have the usual categories for the central reserves, allocations, and the purchase of goods and services. And the schematic design, we have one of those. I would just like to mention just one item on that, and that is the affirmation to invest the general obligation taxable bond series 2022 proceeds. We talked about this a little bit earlier. This is our affirmation of the administration's authority to invest the temporary proceeds from the bond sale that we conducted and closed on April 11th. I guess it closed about a week later. So we now have the proceeds in a bank account, and we need to engage in an investment strategy where they'll seek to offset the cost of the interest until we allocate those bonds or those bond proceeds to a project. Now, we will be coming to the board in June with a global proposal about how to set up the internal structure, the board governance of the allocation of those proceeds. So the money's not going anywhere, it's sitting there until we have that opportunity. But in the meantime, we need to offset that $400,000 a week interest that is on $500 million. So it's important that we have a plan in place to do that investment now, but it's a complicated investment, and thanks to Associate Vice President Stuart Mason, we have the opportunity to do that in a way that's laddered, that makes sure that the money is available when we need it. We don't expend too much risk in terms of preparing that laddering investment portfolio. So we just wanted to confirm with the board our interpretation of the authority for us to invest this. The reason we're asking for that is typically in a regular bond sale, we have a project, we go issue the bonds, and then the money's there. We immediately invest that money in that project. This is going to be a little bit longer, and we just wanted to make sure the board is aware of this and that we would be coming to the board in June with a full-fledged portfolio of how to manage this going forward.
All right, anything else that you want to summarize from the consent report?
No, Madam Chair.
All right. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question, make a comment, or separate an item out from the report to be voted on separately before I invite a motion to recommend approval of the consent report? All right, hearing none, is there a motion to recommend approval of the consent report?
I move it, Chair Mayron.
Is there a second? Second. Any further discussion on the consent report? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Moving on then to the information items. Senior Vice President Franz, anything you wish to highlight here?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. We have 4 topics. The first item is further information about I shouldn't say century bonds anymore, they're interest-only bonds. Information about the sale for your information. Just a quick update that there's a notice provision in here about an intent to swap land with the city of Minneapolis is consistent with our recently approved policy with the board about strategic property use. And this is just a notice of the process is going to begin. It's going to take a long time to get this done, but it's a very important step in that process. But lastly, I just want to mention the annual progress report on sustainability and energy efficiency targets and standards. This report is called for in the board policy. Now, this report not only provides examples of sustainability topics, work, milestones, and accomplishments over the past year, but we also use it as an opportunity to highlight our system-wide sustainability goals as they relate to the Impact 2025 and highlights from our 5 campuses. A really important and informative report. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much for that summary of the information items. Yes, Regent Rosha, did you have something you wanted to raise?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I just wanted to ask, so on the land swap, I think I know the answer, but and I know the territory. Will that have any impact at all on our capacity in the future to develop trails or anything on the transit way? As it, you know, at least for that one little point, it would seem like it would have some impact on our capacity if we wanted to do something, if, let's say, people decided to start getting fit again.
Senior Vice President Franz, assuming people want to get fit again and we'll just have.
Madam Chair, I'm going to have a friend come up, Assistant Vice President Krieger.
All right. Vice President Krieger, you want to take a stab at this?
Chair Mayron, Regent Rosha, I'll put myself in that category as well. There is currently a trail on the transitway, and what we do envision is that we would allow for enough area in terms of right-of-way for any potential expansion of the right-of-way for the transitway, as well as we intend on reserving rights for us to be able to continue to maintain the trail that we have, as well as any potential new driveways in the other area as well. So we haven't dotted the i's and we're just at the process of just starting this disposal and acquisition process. And as part of our negotiations, we'll be looking at all of those details. So when we come back to you later this year or early in 2023, we'll be addressing all of those issues. But the intention is that we would include enough right-of-way for the transitway for any potential expansion.
Madam Chair, thank you. I know our forebears worked very hard to acquire all that property to connect the campuses, and I think that those are important assets. So I appreciate the answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Anything further? That concludes the Finance and Operations Committee meeting. Thank you very much.